Tonight's story comes from a forest ranger assigned to a wilderness outpost so remote it doesn't even appear on most maps. It was supposed to be a routine overnight shift. Equipment checks, radio logs, and silence broken only by wind and distant wildlife. But before midnight, small details began to feel wrong. An extra boot print near the door. A chair that was still warm. A logbook entry written during hours. No one was scheduled to be there. What follows is a first-person account of a single shift that unraveled into something far more disturbing. No monsters. No legends passed down for campfire scares. Just procedures, isolation, and the creeping realization that someone, or something, was sharing the outpost, unseen and uninvited. This is my most terrifying shift. Unseen occupant in a wilderness outpost. A true scary story told from the perspective of the ranger who lived through it. Listen closely. In places like this, the quiet is never empty. My name is Ethan Crowley. I am a feral forest ranger with 8 years of field experience, previously stationed in active wilderness zones across 3 states. On paper, I was considered qualified for low-risk assignments, which is why the request that came across my desk didn't raise immediate concern. The outpost was decommissioned, isolated, and scheduled for a single overnight equipment audit before final closure. No patrols, no visitors, no wildlife monitoring. Just me, a checklist, and 12 hours alone in a structure that was no longer supposed to matter. I arrived just before dusk. The road leading to the outpost was still marked on my GPS, but the last mile was barely passable, reclaimed by pine needles and creeping undergrowth. The building came into view suddenly, a squat wooden structure with a radio mast leaning slightly to the east, as if it had grown tired of standing straight. No lights. No smoke. No movement. Exactly what I expected. The lock on the front door resisted for half a second before turning smoothly. Inside, the air was stale but not rotten, like a room that had been sealed rather than abandoned. I noted that immediately. Abandoned places rot. This one felt preserved. I turned on my headlamp and stepped inside, closing the door behind me out of habit. The interior was familiar in a generic way. Desk, cot, wall, mounted radio, storage cabinets, and a narrow hallway leading to a bunk room and wash area. Dust lay evenly across most surfaces, except the desk. The logbook was sitting open. That stopped me. Logbooks are always closed when not in use. It's basic protocol. Keeps moisture out, pages flat. This one was open to the most recent entry, dated today. I hadn't signed in yet. I assumed at first it belonged to the ranger, who had officially decommissioned the station months ago. But the handwriting was wrong. Not wrong in the sense that it was unfamiliar. Wrong because it was mine. Same slanted capitals. Same habit of pressing too hard on downstrokes. Even the small tear in the paper where I always pause before writing my last name. The entry read 19:05 hours. Arrived without incident. Weather stable. Generator functional. I checked my watch. It was 18:37. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to find a rational explanation that didn't require me to leave. The Forest Service doesn't reward overreaction. Pranks happen. Mistakes happen. I told myself someone had caught my handwriting from old reports. That was easier than the alternative. I signed in beneath the entry. Official time. Official arrival. My handwriting again, now undeniably fresh. The ink glistened under my lamp. As I moved through the outpost, everything appeared operational. Generator fuel was full. Radio powered on without interference. Emergency supplies intact. The cot was made tightly military neat, though no one should have slept in it for months. I noted it, then moved on, refusing to let small inconsistencies dictate my mental state. Outside, night settled quickly. The forest swallowed the last light with practiced ease. I locked the door, checked the perimeter once, and returned inside. At 1912, the radio crackled. Not a hail, just the soft click of a channel opening. "Ethan Crowley," a voice said, calm and close, as if standing just behind the radio console. I froze. The call sign was correct. The voice was male, neutral, unhurried. I responded automatically, training overriding fear. "This is Ranger Crowley." "Identify." Silence. I logged the incident as possible signal bleed. That explanation fit just well enough to let me continue. I heated a ration pack, ate without tasting it, and reviewed the checklist again. More slowly this time. At 20:30, I noticed the second entry in the logbook. I had not written it. 20-30 hours. Subject still unaware. My stomach tightened. I flipped back through the pages. Every prior entry for the past 3 hours detailed my actions with unsettling precision. When I checked the generator, when I paced the perimeter, when I paused too long by the radio, the language was clinical, observational, not quite human in tone. I checked the door. Still locked. Windows secure. No footprints outside except my own. I told myself someone had accessed the outpost earlier and was watching remotely. Though I knew how thin that explanation was, there was no active surveillance here. No power line, no cameras. At 2104, the lights flickered. The generator hummed steadily, but the bulbs dimmed for exactly 2 seconds, then returned to normal. When they did, the logbook page turned on its own, the paper sliding with a dry whisper. A new line appeared, the ink dark and wet. He noticed. I stepped back hard enough to hit the wall. My breathing sounded too loud in the small room, like I was giving myself away. I didn't run. That's important. I didn't run because everything in me understood, in a way I can't fully explain, that whatever was documenting me expected a pattern. Deviations felt dangerous. I sat at the desk. My hand shook as I picked up the pen and wrote a single line beneath the entry. "Who are you?" The response came immediately. Letters forming as if guided by an invisible hand pressing down through the page. "Occupant." The radio clicked on again. "Remain calm, Ethan," the voice said. "This process concludes by morning." I asked the only question that mattered. "Are you inside the outpost?" There was a pause long enough for hope to form. "Yes," the voice said. I checked every room with my flashlight. Slowly, methodically. No closets left unopened. No shadows unaccounted for. The building was empty. When I returned to the main room, the cot was no longer made. An impression sank into the mattress, deepening gradually, as if someone unseen was sitting down. The logbook recorded the moment before I could react. Occupant now seated. I stood there, unable to move, as the mattress compressed fully and the blanket folded inward, careful, deliberate. Something was sharing the room with me, documenting my behavior, responding to my questions, and waiting for something to finish. Outside, the forest went completely silent, and the night had only just begun. I did not sleep. That wasn't a choice. My body simply refused to cross that threshold where unconsciousness might leave me vulnerable to whatever was sharing the outpost with me. I sat rigidly in the wooden chair by the desk, my back straight, my eyes fixed on the cot. The impression in the mattress remained, as if weight still pressed down on it, though nothing visible occupied the space. Minutes passed, then longer stretches of time that blurred together. The forest outside stayed unnaturally quiet, no insects, no wind through the trees. Even the generator seemed to lower its pitch, humming softly, as though it, too, was trying not to draw attention. At 22:17, the logbook page shifted again. Elevated stress detected. The new entry read. I hadn't moved. My breathing was shallow but controlled. Still, it knew. I forced myself to speak evenly. What do you want? The pen rolled slightly across the desk on its own, stopping near the edge, then lifted. The page accepted new writing. Completion of overlap. The term meant nothing to me, but it carried weight. Like official language stripped of emotion. I asked, overlap of what? The radio clicked, then crackled with faint static before the voice returned. It sounded closer now, no longer anchored to the console. Your presence intersects with an unresolved occupancy, it said. Standard procedure requires observation until dominance is established. My mouth went dry. Dominance, I repeated. Yes. I stood slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. The impression on the cot deepened slightly, as if reacting to my change in posture. You said you're an occupant, I said. This station was decommissioned. Incorrect, the voice replied. Physical operations were suspended. Occupancy persisted. I backed toward the door, my hand inching closer to the handle. The logbook responded before I could touch it. Exit attempts before conclusion are not advised. I stopped. My pulse hammered in my ears. You're threatening me, I said. No, the voice answered calmly. I am documenting. The generator coughed once, then steadied. The lights dimmed again. This time for longer. When they brightened, the desk chair across from me was pulled out. Slowly, deliberately, it slid closer to the desk, its legs scraping softly across the floor. I felt the pressure in the room change, like air before a storm. Not heavier, just attentive. I sat. Something about the situation made it clear that refusal would escalate things I didn't understand. As soon as I did, the unseen presence seemed to settle, the tension easing slightly. Good, the voice said. Cooperation noted. I clenched my fists in my lap. How long have you been here? The pen hesitated this time, hovering above the page before writing. Duration is subjective. That's not an answer. It is the only accurate one. The clock on the wall ticked loudly now, each second pronounced. I realized with a jolt that it hadn't been ticking earlier. I had no memory of hearing it at all until now. At 23:02, the logbook updated again. Phase 2 initiated. I swallowed. What happens in Phase 2? The cot creaked softly, springs compressing as if weight shifted. Behavioral alignment, the voice said. I stood abruptly. No. Whatever this is, it ends now. I'm calling this in. I reached for the radio. My fingers closed around the handset, but before I could lift it, the temperature in the room dropped sharply. My breath fogged in front of my face. The radio hissed, then went dead. The voice came from everywhere at once, layered, overlapping itself by a fraction of a second, like an echo that arrived too soon. External communication is not permitted during overlap. The logbook pen snapped in half with a sharp crack, the sound making me flinch. I stepped back, my heel catching on the edge of the rug. The unseen presence reacted immediately. The chair across from me scraped back violently, slamming into the wall hard enough to rattle the shelves. Remain seated, the voice commanded. That was the first time it sounded anything like irritated. I sat again. The pressure eased. Minutes dragged on. The presence did not speak. It simply existed, close enough that I could feel subtle changes in the air, like someone shifting their weight beside me. At 116, the front door handle rattled. My heart leapt. I stared at it, half expecting to see it turn. It didn't. Instead, the sound came again. Softer this time, almost curious. The logbook documented it. External mimicry unsuccessful. What does that mean? I asked, my voice barely steady. It is attempting to create a false continuity, the voice replied. The presence on the cot shifted again. The mattress dipped further than before, the shape now unmistakably human in proportion, shoulders, hips, legs. Yes, the voice said. Previous occupant. Cold crept up my spine. You're not alone either. No, it agreed. That is why overlap persists. I stared at the shape, my mind racing. What happened to them? The penless logbook still found a way to answer, letters appearing as if burned into the page. Noncompliance. The door handle rattled again, harder this time, as if someone outside had grown impatient. The presence beside me leaned closer. I could feel it now, a faint disturbance against my shoulder, like heat without warmth. You are performing adequately, the voice said. Current probability of survival exceeds prior subject by 17%. That's supposed to reassure me, I whispered. Yes. The clock struck 1:00 a.m. The logbook turned to a fresh page on its own. Final assessment window approaching. Outside. Something heavy brushed against the walls of the outpost, moving slowly, deliberately, circling. The presence on the cot did not move to investigate. It already knew what was out there. And for the first time since arriving, I understood something with terrifying clarity. Whatever was documenting me was not the most dangerous thing in the room. It was watching to see which of us would still be there when morning came. By the time the clock read 1:08 a.m., I understood the rules without ever being told them directly. Sudden movements provoked reaction. Silence was interpreted as compliance. Questions were tolerated only if they did not imply refusal. The presence documenting me was not my enemy in the immediate sense. It was an assessor, a process, something that existed to observe conflict rather than initiate it. The thing outside was different. Its movement against the walls was slow and uneven. Not like an animal pacing, but like something learning the dimensions of a shape it no longer fully remembered. The siding creaked softly as weight shifted along it. Once, something scraped lightly against the window, not with claws, but with something broad and flat, like a palm testing glass. The documenting presence reacted subtly. The pressure in the room tightened, the air sharpening, as if attention had narrowed. External subject escalating, the voice said quietly. Remain passive. I did not argue. I did not move. I focused on breathing slowly through my nose, counting each inhale and exhale like I had been taught during cold water survival training. Panic wastes energy. Energy draws notice. The logbook updated itself. Subject demonstrating adaptive restraint. The scraping stopped. For several long minutes, nothing happened at all. Then the footsteps began. They came from the roof. Each step was careful, placed with intent, as though the thing above me was distributing its weight deliberately, afraid of falling through. Dust drifted down from the ceiling beams, thin streams catching the light from my headlamp. I clenched my jaw hard enough that my teeth ached. The cot creaked beside me, The unseen occupant shifted, sitting more upright. I felt the faint displacement of air as it leaned forward, attentive. "You will not respond," the voice instructed. The footsteps paused directly above the main room. A low sound followed. Not a growl. Not speech. It was a breath taken too deep, too slow, like lungs stretching to remember how they worked. The front door handle turned. This time, it turned fully. The lock held. Something on the other side exhaled again, closer now, its breath seeping through the cracks in the frame, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and old wood. I tasted metal at the back of my throat. The voice remained calm. "This concludes external pressure testing." The footsteps retreated from the roof, fading unevenly toward the tree line. The pressure against the walls eased. Night sounds did not return, but the oppressive silence softened, as though the forest had been holding its breath and was now cautiously releasing it. I slumped slightly in the chair before catching myself and straightening again. "Is it gone?" I asked. "Yes," the voice said. "For now." The logbook turned another page. "Dominance unresolved." It read, "Final determination pending." I swallowed. What happens if dominance isn't established? The presence beside me did not answer immediately. For the first time, it seemed to hesitate. "Continuation," it said at last. "That's not an answer either. It is the most humane one available." The clock ticked steadily toward morning. 2:14, 2:47, 3:03. Time felt thick, heavy, as if it resisted moving forward. My muscles cramped from holding the same rigid posture. But I did not allow myself to shift more than a fraction of an inch at a time. At 30:19, the pressure in the room changed again. Not tightening this time. Receding. The unseen presence on the cot began to lose definition. The mattress rose slightly, springs decompressing with soft metallic sighs. The blanket unfolded, smoothing itself back into place. I watched, barely daring to breathe. The voice spoke, quieter now. "External subject withdrawing from overlap zone." Relief washed through me so fast it made me dizzy. So it's over. Nearly. The logbook's final entry began to write itself, slower than before. "Primary occupancy reassignment in progress." My stomach dropped. Reassignment. Yes. I stood before I could stop myself. The pressure spiked instantly, sharp and warning, but not violent. "Clarify," I said, my voice tight. The pen paused, then continued. "Station requires a single continuous occupant to prevent reemergence." I shook my head. "No. That's not how this works. I leave at dawn." That was the assignment. "The assignment is obsolete," the voice replied. "Conditions have changed." The front door creaked softly as if settling. The lock clicked, not engaging, but disengaging. I looked at it, then back at the desk. "You said survival probability." "Yes." "Then, let me leave." The presence seemed to consider this. The air grew still, expectant. "You may," the voice said finally, "provided continuity is preserved." I stared at the logbook. At the last line being written. "Occupancy accepted. I'm not staying," I said. "I won't." The pen stopped. The room felt empty suddenly, hollowed out. "You misunderstand," the voice said, not unkindly. "You are not the one being reassigned." The door handle turned slowly. The forest outside exhaled. Something moved away from the outpost, its retreat uneven but purposeful, as if carrying new instructions. The pressure lifted completely. The room felt normal, cold, silent, empty. At 5:42 a.m., dawn broke through the trees in pale gray streaks. Birds began calling hesitantly, Then, with growing confidence, wind stirred the branches. The logbook lay still. I waited until full daylight before moving. When I finally stood, my legs nearly gave out beneath me. I unlocked the door, stepped outside, and filled my lungs with clean morning air. Nothing followed me. I did not look back. I reported everything, every sound, every entry, every impossible detail. The official response came 3 days later. The outpost was permanently sealed. My report was classified as stress-induced misperception. No follow-up investigation was scheduled. But sometimes, when I file routine paperwork, I notice small details in my handwriting that I don't remember forming. A word choice I wouldn't normally use. A line pressed too hard into the page. And once, in the margin of a maintenance report, I found a note I know I didn't write. Continuity preserved. I no longer accept overnight assignments, because something is still occupying that outpost, and it knows exactly how I survived. My name is Lucas Reed. I am writing this as a formal personal record of events that occurred during my first and only night assigned alone to a remote forest outpost operated on the Regional Wildfire Monitoring Program. I was 29 years old at the time, recently transferred from administrative duty to field rotation, and I had no prior disciplinary issues, psychological flags, or recorded incidents that would suggest stress-induced hallucination or impaired judgment. What follows is a precise account, written as clearly as possible, of that night. I am not asking to be believed. I am documenting what happened because I no longer trust my own memory to stay intact on its own. The outpost was located several miles from the nearest ranger station, reachable only by a narrow gravel road that cut through dense pine forest. The building itself was small and functional, a single-story structure with a radio room, a bunk, a kitchenette, and a weathered porch that faced a clearing, just wide enough for a supply truck to turn around. The assignment was simple. I was to stay overnight, monitor the emergency frequency, log any wildlife movement or fire indicators, and maintain radio contact checks at the top of every hour. I had been assured it was quiet work, routine, a good way to ease someone new into solo duty. I arrived shortly before sunset. I performed the standard equipment check, logged the condition of the generator, tested the lights, and powered on the radio console. The radio was old but reliable, an analog unit with manual dials and a faint hum that settled into the background once it warmed up. I conducted the scheduled check-in with Central Dispatch. My voice sounded calm, professional. I remember being proud of that. Once the sun dipped below the tree line, the forest changed in a way that felt heavier than I expected. The silence wasn't complete, but it was layered. Wind through branches, distant insects, the occasional snap of wood cooling after a warm day. I made myself dinner and tried to read, but my attention kept drifting back to the radio. It wasn't doing anything unusual. No static bursts. No incoming traffic. Just that steady hum, like a held breath. At exactly 8:00 p.m., I reached for the microphone to perform the routine call. Before I spoke, before I even pressed the transmit button, the radio crackled. Outpost 3, radio check. The voice was calm, neutral, male. Dispatch. I froze with the microphone halfway to my mouth. They were early. That was my first thought. Maybe they were testing me. I pressed the button and responded, giving the correct call sign and confirming clarity. There was a brief pause, then dispatch acknowledged and signed off. I checked my watch. It read 7:59. I logged it as a minor discrepancy. Clock drift. Human error. Nothing worth noting beyond that. I settled back in, but the sense of being slightly out of step with the night stayed with me. Around 9:30, I found myself thinking about how isolated the outpost was. Not afraid, exactly. Just aware. The thought formed clearly in my head, unspoken. If something happened out here, no one would know for hours. The radio crackled again. Repeat last transmission. Outpost 3. I stared at the console. I hadn't transmitted anything. My hand wasn't on the microphone. I hadn't even moved. After a few seconds, I responded, explaining there had been no transmission. Dispatch replied with a short acknowledgement and said they might have picked up interference. Their tone didn't change, but mine did. I could hear it when I logged the exchange. A slight tension, like my voice was bracing for something I couldn't name. By 10:00 p.m., I was alert in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine or duty. Every sound felt sharpened. When I performed the scheduled check-in, dispatch responded normally, but there was a half-second delay that made my skin prickle. It felt like someone waiting to make sure they were right before speaking. I sat at the small desk, looking at the radio, and tried to slow my breathing. I told myself I was tired. New environment. First solo night. My thoughts were running ahead of me, because I was nervous about doing everything by the book. I remember thinking, very deliberately, don't let it get to you. The radio clicked. Copy that, Lucas. They used my name. Dispatch rarely did that outside of emergencies. I hadn't said anything out loud. I hadn't even keyed the mic. My chair scraped loudly as I stood up. The sound seemed to echo in the small room. I asked them to repeat. There was a pause long enough that I wondered if the radio had cut out entirely. Then, Outpost 3. Was there a question? I asked why they'd used my name. The response came back smooth, almost rehearsed. You identified yourself at check-in. I hadn't. I was sure of that. I checked the log. My earlier transmissions were recorded in my handwriting, and they did not include my name. Just the call sign. Procedure. I pointed this out over the radio. There was a longer pause this time. Negative, dispatch said. You stated your name clearly. Something in their tone had shifted. It wasn't threatening. It was confident. Certain in a way that made my stomach twist. I tried to regain control of the situation. I suggested we run a full radio diagnostic. Dispatch agreed. We tested frequencies, signal strength, and backup channels. Everything came back normal. No crosstalk. No recorded interference. According to the system, nothing unusual was happening. After the diagnostic, there was silence. Not even the hum. The radio went completely quiet, as if it had been turned off. I checked the power. Everything was still on. I reached out and rested my hand on the console, grounding myself in the cold metal. I thought irrationally, I wish it would just say something. The radio crackled to life. Still with us, Lucas. My mouth went dry. I hadn't pressed the button. I hadn't moved. I hadn't spoken. The voice wasn't dispatch anymore. It sounded close, like someone leaning in toward a microphone in the same room, careful not to breathe too loudly. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was suddenly aware of every thought in my head, each one forming with a strange sense of risk, as if thinking itself had become a kind of transmission. The radio clicked again. You don't have to answer, the voice said. We can hear you anyway. At that moment, I understood something that has stayed with me ever since. The radio wasn't responding to my voice. It was responding to the moment just before speech, to the place where intention forms. And it had been listening long before I arrived. I remained standing beside the desk for several minutes after that last transmission, my hand still resting on the radio console, as if it might suddenly move on its own. I was acutely aware of my thoughts in a way that felt invasive, like standing in a room with one-way glass and realizing too late which side you were on. I tried to empty my mind, focusing only on physical details. The weight of my boots, the faint vibration of the generator, the smell of old wood and dust. But even that felt deliberate, shaped, as if whatever was listening could still hear the effort behind it. I decided to follow procedure. When something doesn't make sense, you document and escalate. I picked up the incident log and began writing, carefully forcing myself to form each word slowly. I described the anomalous transmissions, the use of my name, the unexplained responses. I did not write about the voice sounding close. I did not write about the sense that my thoughts were no longer private. I told myself those impressions were subjective and could wait until morning. As soon as I finished the sentence, I thought, this is going to look ridiculous. The radio crackled softly, almost gently. It's better than leaving it out, the voice said. I dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the desk, the sound jarring enough to make me flinch. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like might drown out everything else. I stared at the radio, my mind racing despite my efforts to slow it. I wanted to ask who was speaking. I wanted to demand an explanation. I wanted to unplug the entire unit and throw it out into the clearing. Instead, I forced myself to sit down. If this was stress panic, or some strange auditory hallucination, reacting emotionally would only make it worse. That was the logic I clung to. I took a slow breath and pressed the transmit button, choosing my words carefully. This is Outpost 3, I said. Identify yourself. There was no immediate response. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I wondered if I had imagined the last exchange entirely. If speaking out loud would somehow break whatever feedback loop my brain had fallen into. Then the radio clicked. You already know who we are, the voice replied. It no longer bothered pretending to be dispatch. There was a subtle warmth to it now, almost reassuring. You wouldn't be here if you didn't. That made no sense. And yet the moment I heard it, a flicker of recognition stirred somewhere in my chest. Not a memory, exactly. More like a feeling I had once understood something important, and then deliberately forgotten it. I shook my head hard, as if I could dislodge the thought. This is not funny, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. If this is a test or some kind of prank, it needs to stop now. The response came instantly, overlapping the end of my sentence. We don't joke about safety, Lucas. My name again. Use it casually. Familiar. I felt a cold prickle crawl up my arms. I glanced toward the window. The forest beyond the glass was pitch black, the clearing swallowed by darkness. For the first time since arriving, I felt truly alone, not just physically, but in a way that suggested something had closed a door behind me without asking. I stood and walked to the breaker panel, flipping the switch that cut power to the radio. The hum died instantly. The room felt unnaturally quiet. I waited, holding my breath. Nothing happened. Relief washed through me so quickly it left me dizzy. I leaned against the wall, letting my eyes close for just a moment. Whatever had been happening, it was over. faulty equipment, fatigue, an overactive imagination fueled by isolation. I opened my eyes. The radio crackled. There was no power. The lights flickered faintly, but the console remained dark, the dials unlit. And yet the voice came through clearly, without static, without distortion. "You can't turn us off," it said. "You're already tuned in." I stumbled backward, my shoulder hitting the edge of the bunk. Fear surged, sharp and undeniable now. I backed toward the door, my mind screaming at me to get out, to put distance between myself and that voice. But as soon as the thought formed, "Run," the radio spoke again. "The road isn't safe tonight." I froze. That was exactly what I had been thinking. The gravel road was narrow, unlit, with steep drop-offs in places. Driving it at night was risky even in good conditions. The idea of navigating it while shaken and panicked made my chest tighten. "How do you know that?" I demanded, though part of me already knew the answer. "We hear what you hear," the voice said. "Why feel what you feel? That's how the system works." The word system caught my attention. It sounded procedural, bureaucratic, familiar. I forced myself to breathe slowly. "What system?" I asked. There was a pause, longer than before. When the voice returned, it sounded thoughtful. "The one that keeps the forest quiet," it said. "The one that makes sure people stay where they're supposed to." A memory surfaced then, unbidden. Training materials. Briefings I'd skimmed without much interest. References to unclassified anomalies, to patterns of lost hikers and inexplicable radio interference that never quite rose to the level of formal investigation. I dismissed them as folklore, cautionary tales passed down to scare new recruits into following protocol. I realized, with a sickening clarity, that the radio wasn't malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. "Why me?" I asked quietly. The answer came not through the radio, but in my own mind, fully formed and impossible to ignore. "Because you're alone. Because you're listening." The radio clicked in confirmation. "You're new," the voice said. "Unshaped. That makes you useful." I felt a surge of anger cut through the fear. "Useful for what?" "To relay," it said simply. "To maintain the signal." I backed away again, until I felt the cold night air seeping in around the doorframe. My hand hovered over the handle. I thought of Central Dispatch, of the idea of human voices on the other end of the line. I imagined calling for help, imagined their confusion, their concern. Before I could act on it, the radio spoke once more, softer now. "They won't hear you," it said. "Not the way you hear us." I understood then that whatever was speaking wasn't confined to the radio. The radio was just the interface, the part of the process meant to feel familiar, official, safe. The real transmission was happening somewhere deeper, in the quiet space where thought becomes intention. I let go of the door handle. The fear was still there, but it had settled into something heavier, more resigned. The night stretched on ahead of me, unbroken, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I was not leaving the outpost until morning. If morning was still something that applied to this place. The radio crackled one last time before falling silent again. "Get some rest, Lucas," the voice said. "You're going to need it." I did not sleep. I lay on the narrow bunk with my boots still on, staring at the ceiling as the minutes crawled past. Every time my eyes closed, my thoughts drifted, and every time they did, I felt that subtle pressure again. like attention focusing on me from somewhere just beyond the walls. I learned quickly that silence was safer than thinking. Not quiet silence, but mental stillness. I counted my breaths. I cataloged physical sensations. I avoided forming sentences in my head. Around midnight, the generator coughed and briefly dipped in pitch. My heart jumped, but the power stabilized. The lights remained on. The radio stayed dark and quiet. That silence was worse than the voice had been. It felt intentional, like being watched without the courtesy of acknowledgement. At 12:17 a.m., the radio clicked once. I did not react. I stayed perfectly still, my breathing shallow, my eyes fixed on a knot in the wooden ceiling. If it was waiting for my attention, I would not give it that satisfaction. Another click, then another, slow, patient. Finally, the voice returned, lower than before, stripped of warmth. "You're doing it wrong." My pulse spiked despite my efforts. I did not answer. "You don't have to be afraid," it continued. "You're already cooperating." That word again. Cooperating. As if I had agreed to something without realizing it. My thoughts slipped despite myself. I thought of the incident log sitting on the desk, of how official everything felt. How easy it would be to rationalize this later, if I survived the night. The radio responded immediately. "That's the instinct we rely on," the voice said. The need to explain. I sat up slowly. My hands were trembling. But anger burned through the fear now, sharper and more focused. "You're not real," I said aloud. "You're a pattern. A malfunction. Something someone misunderstood and built rules around." There was a pause long enough that I almost believed I had struck something true. Then the voice replied, calm and precise. "Reality is a set of permissions," it said. "You are standing inside one of them." I swung my legs off the bunk and stood. My knees felt weak, but I forced myself upright. If this thing fed on compliance, then refusing to participate was the only control I had left. "I'm leaving at first light," I said. "I'm filing a full report. Whatever this is, it ends tonight." The radio crackled softly, almost sympathetically. "You won't remember everything," it said. "No one does." A cold realization settled over me. I had been assuming survival meant escape. But what if survival was the mechanism? What if people left the outpost carrying only fragments? Enough confusion to bury the truth under procedure and doubt. The lights flickered again. Outside, the forest shifted with a sound like a collective breath. Being released. I walked to the window despite myself and pulled back the curtain a fraction of an inch. The clearing was no longer empty. Figures stood at the edge of the tree line. Not close enough to make out details, but close enough to see that they were human-shaped. They were perfectly still, arranged in a loose arc facing the outpost. They did not move when I looked at them. They did not need to. The radio spoke quietly behind me. "Past relays," it said. "Some stayed longer than others." My throat tightened. "They're dead?" "Not exactly," the voice replied. "They're listening." I stepped back from the window, my back hitting the wall. Panic surged, wild and overwhelming, and with it came a flood of uncontrolled thoughts. Images of running, of screaming into the radio, of tearing the equipment apart with my bare hands. The voice sharpened instantly. "Careful," it warned. "That kind of signal carries." I clamped my hands over my ears, as if that might help. "What do you want?" I shouted. There was no hesitation this time. "For you finish the shift," it said. "For you to keep the line open until sunrise." "And then what?" I demanded. A pause. Longer than any before. Then you'll go home, it said. And the forest will remain where it belongs. Something about that answer felt incomplete. Deliberately so. I understood then that this wasn't a negotiation. It was containment. The outpost wasn't meant to protect people from the forest. It was meant to protect the forest from being noticed. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 2:03 a.m. hours stretched ahead of me like an endurance test. I sat at the desk, hands folded in front of me, eyes fixed on the dark radio. I focused on staying present, on not letting my mind wander. Every so often, the radio would click, a reminder that it was still there, still aware. At 40:46 a.m., the first hint of gray touched the edges of the window. Dawn was coming. Relief washed over me so strongly it almost made me laugh. I had done it. I had stayed. I had survived. The radio clicked one final time. "You did well," the voice said. "You kept the signal stable. I'm done," I said hoarsely. "This ends now." "Yes," it agreed. "For you." The sun crested the tree line, fluting with clearing with pale light. I rushed to the window. The figures were gone. The forest looked ordinary again. Trees, shadows, nothing out of place. The radio was silent, truly silent. I left the outpost an hour later, driving carefully down the gravel road, with my incident log on the passenger seat. By the time I reached Central Dispatch, my hands had stopped shaking. The world felt normal again, too normal. They took my report seriously, too seriously. They thanked me for my diligence and told me I'd done exactly what was expected of me. When I asked about the radio anomalies, they exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. "Equipment fatigue," one of them said gently. "It happens. Later at home." I opened my notebook to review what I'd written that night. Several pages were missing. In their place was a single line, written in my handwriting, neat and deliberate. "Signal stable. Shift completed without incident. I don't work field assignments anymore. I avoid radios when I can. But sometimes, when I'm alone and my thoughts drift too close to that night, I feel that familiar pressure again, like something tuning itself, waiting for me to finish the sentence. And I stop thinking immediately, because now I understand the most important rule. It only listens when you're listening back. My name is Nolan Pierce. I am a field ranger assigned under the Department of Interior, certified for solo posts, wildfire monitoring, and extended isolation duty. I accepted the transfer to Station K-17 knowing its history, knowing that the previous ranger had gone missing 6 months earlier, and knowing that no official explanation had ever been written into the system. What I did not know, what no briefing or incident report prepared me for, was how the place still felt occupied. Not abandoned, not paused, occupied. The access road ended a mile short of the station, washed out by spring flooding that had never been repaired. I hiked the remaining distance with a 70-pound pack, the forest quiet in a way that felt deliberate, like sound itself had been instructed to stay away. The station came into view just before dusk, a single-story structure of treated wood and reinforced concrete, solar panels angled toward the sky, radio antenna rising above the tree line. There was no visible damage, no broken windows, no signs of forced entry. It looked maintained, as if someone had been there that morning and simply stepped away. The door was unlocked. That alone was not unusual. Rangers in remote posts often left doors unsecured. What unsettled me was the temperature. The late autumn air was cold enough that my breath fogged. But the moment I stepped inside, warmth wrapped around me. Not the stale warmth of trapped air, but the fresh kind, like the room had recently been full of moving bodies. The first chair I touched was in the radio room. A standard, issue swivel chair, vinyl seat, metal frame. When my hand pressed against it, I pulled back instinctively. It was warm, not sun-warmed. Not residual heat from the day. Human warmth. The kind of warmth that fades quickly once a body leaves. I stood there longer than I should have, hand hovering. Waiting for the rational explanation to surface. It didn't. I checked the rest of the room. The desk lamp was off. The radio was powered down. No generator noise. No active heat source. Still, the second chair, positioned at the small planning table, was warm too. I pressed my palm flat against it this time, counting silently. 1, 2, 3. The heat lingered. I told myself it was insulation. Thermal retention. Old building quirks. I said the words out loud, partly to hear a human voice in the space. My own voice sounded wrong. Like it didn't belong there. The missing ranger's name was Evan Holt. I had read his file twice before accepting the assignment. 34 years old. 8 years of service. No disciplinary actions. Last transmission logged at 21:17 6 months ago. Routine weather update. No distress call. Search teams found nothing beyond the station perimeter. No tracks, no personal effects missing. His vehicle was still parked out back. I found his jacket hanging on a hook near the door. Still heavy. Still warm. That was the moment the weight of the place finally settled into my chest. Warmth doesn't last 6 months. Not in the wilderness. Not without power. Not without people. I moved through the station methodically, as I had been trained. Kitchen first. The kettle on the stove was cold, but the handle felt like it had been touched recently. The table had 3 chairs around it. All 3 were warm. One had an indentation in the cushion that hadn't fully rebounded. I pressed 2 fingers into it and felt the fabric slowly rise back into place, like the chair was breathing. My pulse climbed, slow and steady. Panic would have been easier. Panic is loud. This was quiet and invasive. The sleeping quarters were worse. 2 bunks. One neatly made. One unmade. The mattress on the lower bunk radiated heat through the thin sheet. I stood there staring at it, imagining the shape of a body that should have been gone for half a year. I imagined Evan Holt lying there, eyes open, listening to footsteps that never arrived. I checked the clock on the wall. It was working. The time was correct. The date was today. Everything about the station insisted that was functioning normally, except for the absence of the one person who should have been here. I set my pack down and forced myself into routine. Inventory, power systems, water supply, radio check. The solar batteries were fully charged. Too full, considering no one had been drawing power. The logbook lay open on the desk, a pen resting across the page as if it had been set down moments ago. The last entry was dated 6 months back. Evan's handwriting was neat, controlled, everything normal. Still no contact from Central. Chairs feel warm again today. I read that line 3 times before the meaning settled in. Chairs feel warm again today. Again. He had noticed it. He had written it down. My mouth went dry as I turned the page, expecting more entries. There were none. The radio crackled softly behind me. I froze. I hadn't powered it on. Slowly, carefully, I turned around. The display was lit now, glowing faintly. Static whispered through the speaker, the sound low and intimate, like someone breathing close to my ear. I approached it step by step, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to walk back into the dark and not look behind me. My hand hovered over the power switch. Before I touched it, the static shifted. "Nolan," a voice said. It was faint, distorted, but unmistakably clear. I did not respond. Training kicked in hard. Unknown transmission. Possible interference. Hallucination caused by stress. I said none of those things out loud. I simply stood there, staring at the radio as the warmth in the room seemed to increase, pressing against my skin. "Nolan," the voice repeated. Closer now. "You're sitting in my chair." My knees weakened. I wasn't sitting. I hadn't touched a chair since entering the room. I looked down anyway, needing confirmation from my own eyes. I was standing exactly where Evan's chair had been pulled back from the desk, the seat still warm beneath the air. The radio went silent. I backed away, heart hammering, until my shoulders hit the wall. The warmth in the room began to fade, not disappearing but settling, like embers after a fire. I powered the radio down with a shaking hand and unplugged it entirely. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. Night fell quickly outside. The forest pressed against the windows, dark and watchful. I told myself I would stay until morning. That was the assignment. Observe. Report. Maintain presence. Leaving without cause would trigger an inquiry. I wasn't prepared to explain. I chose the upper bunk, the only surface in the station that felt neutral, neither warm nor cold. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I listened to the subtle sounds of the building. Wood contracting, wind brushing the walls, and beneath it all the faint, rhythmic creak of a chair being shifted slightly closer to my bed. I did not sleep. Somewhere in the station, something waited, patient and familiar, confident that I would eventually need to sit down. I learned early in ranger training that the first night in an isolated post is always the hardest. Your body hasn't adjusted yet. Your mind fills the silence with things that don't belong there. That's what I told myself as the darkness outside station K-17 thickened and pressed against the windows like a physical thing. That's what I repeated when the floor creaked beneath me, even though I hadn't moved. I checked my watch. 22:41. I had been lying on the upper bunk for nearly 3 hours, fully dressed, boots still on, hands folded over my chest like I was bracing for impact. The air had cooled slightly, but not enough to explain the warmth that lingered in the room below me. It was as if the station itself was holding heat, refusing to let go of it. The first sound came from the kitchen. It was subtle, a soft scrape, wood against wood, a chair leg shifting a few inches across the floor. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, followed by a pause. Then another scrape. Slow, deliberate, like someone adjusting their position, getting comfortable. I slid off the bunk as quietly as I could, my boots barely making a sound on the floor. The darkness inside the station wasn't complete. Moonlight filtered through the windows, casting pale rectangles across the floor. I stood at the edge of the sleeping area, heart pounding, and watched the kitchen. One of the chairs was no longer tucked under the table. It had been pulled back just enough that someone could sit in it. I hadn't moved it. I knew that with absolute certainty. I hadn't even entered the kitchen since evening. My eyes tracked the chair's position, the angle of its legs, the faint scuff mark on the floor where it had been dragged. I told myself it could have shifted earlier. That stress was rewriting my memory. The explanation felt thin even as I thought it. Then the chair moved again. It didn't slide this time. It rocked. Back slightly, then forward, as if weight had settled into it. The warmth in the room surged, wrapping around my face and hands. I smelled something faint and human. Sweat. Fabric, the ghost of aftershave. No, I whispered before I could stop myself. The word felt wrong in the air, like I had broken a rule I didn't know existed. I took a step back, then another, until my heel caught the edge of the bunk frame. My mind raced through procedures. Radio for assistance. Document disturbance. Exit if personal safety is compromised. None of those applied cleanly to what I was seeing. The chair stopped moving. For a long moment, nothing happened. The station held its breath. I realized I was doing the same. Then I heard it, breathing. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It was slow and steady. The kind of breathing someone has when they're resting after a long day. It came from the space just above the chair seat, where a chest would be if someone were sitting there. I forced myself to turn on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and landed squarely on the chair. It was empty. The seat cushion, however, was deeply compressed, as if someone very real and very solid was sitting there. The vinyl gleamed slightly under the light, stretched tight over the invisible shape. I watched, frozen, as the cushion slowly sank another inch, responding to a shift in unseen weight. I backed away until I hit the wall. My spine pressed hard against it. My pulse roared in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of the building, to put distance between myself and whatever was occupying that chair. The breathing continued. "Ivan," I said, the name slipping out before I could stop it. The breathing paused. The warmth intensified, blooming outward from the chair like a heat wave. My flashlight beam flickered, then steadied. The cushion creaked softly as the invisible weight leaned forward. "I didn't leave," a voice said. It didn't come from the radio this time. It came from the chair itself, from the empty air where a mouth should have been. The voice was calm, tired, and unbearably close. "You did?" I said, though my voice shook. "You went missing." A quiet sound followed. Not laughter, something softer. "Regret, maybe." "That's what they wrote," the voice replied. "That's not what happened." The chair shifted again, turning slightly, as if its occupant were angling toward me. I could feel it now, the pressure of a presence in the room. The sense of being watched by something that knew me far better than I knew it. "You're not supposed to stand," the voice continued. "You're supposed to sit. That's how it works." My stomach dropped. How what works? There was a pause, longer this time. The breathing grew heavier, uneven. "The station," Even said, "It doesn't like being empty." The flashlight beam trembled as my hand shook. I glanced toward the door, calculating distance, timing, escape routes. The thought of turning my back on the chair made my skin crawl. "What did it do to you?" I asked. The cushion slowly rose, just a little, as if the invisible figure were shrugging. "It kept me," Even said, "warm, busy, useful." The words settled into me like ice water. I thought of the logbook entry. "Chairs feel warm again today." I thought of the battery levels, the untouched supplies, the sense that the station had never truly been alone. I tried to leave. Even went on. 6 months ago. Packed my things. Shut everything down. Walked out the door. The chair creaked softly as the unseen weight leaned back. And then I realized I was still sitting here. My throat tightened. "That's not possible." "That's what I said," Even replied. But every time I stood up, the station pulled me back. Not physically. It didn't have to. It just made the chairs comfortable. The warmth surged again, this time sharper, almost painful against my skin. I felt sweat bead on my forehead despite the cool air outside. "You shouldn't have come," Evan said, and for the first time, there was something like fear in his voice. It gets harder when there's more than one. The chair slid back abruptly, scraping hard against the floor. I flinched, nearly dropping the flashlight. The breathing stopped. The cushion slowly rose, returning to its normal shape. The warmth drained from the room so quickly I shivered. The chair sat empty and ordinary, like it had been all along. I stood there for several minutes, listening, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The station settled back into its quiet hum, the sounds of the forest seeping faintly through the walls. I didn't trust the silence. I moved fast then, adrenaline overriding fear. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and headed for the door. My hand closed around the handle. It was warm. Not just warm. Hot. Like it had been held continuously, firmly, by someone who had no intention of letting go. Behind me, I heard the soft, familiar scrape of a chair being pulled back from the table. "Nolan," Ivan said gently from somewhere very close, "you're going to need to sit down before you hurt yourself." The lights flickered. The door handle did not turn. And I realized, with a sinking certainty that hollowed out my chest, that the station wasn't trapping me by force. It was waiting for me to get tired enough to choose to stay. I don't know how long I stood there with my hand wrapped around the door handle, feeling the heat pulse against my palm like a living thing. My muscles locked, caught between the instinct to flee and the creeping understanding that leaving was no longer a simple physical act. The station wasn't barricaded. The door wasn't jammed. It was waiting for me to make a different choice. Behind me, the chair scraped again. Slow, patient, close enough that I could feel the vibration through the floorboards. I let go of the handle. The moment my fingers released it, the heat vanished. The metal cooled instantly like it had never been touched. That scared me more than if it had stayed hot. It meant the station was paying attention. I turned around. The chair in the kitchen was pulled back fully now, angled toward me. The seat was already compressed, already warm, as if someone had risen, just long enough to invite me closer. I could smell that faint human scent again, stronger this time. Sweat and fabric and something old, like a jacket that had never fully dried. "I don't belong here," I said, forcing the words out. Evan's presence shifted. I didn't hear him move, but I felt it. The way you feel someone step closer behind you without touching you. "That's what I said," he replied. His voice wasn't coming from one place anymore. It seemed to exist throughout the room, woven into the walls and the air. The station doesn't care who belongs. It only cares that someone stays. I swallowed hard. Why chairs? There was a pause. Thoughtful this time. Because people sit, Evan said. They rest. They stop moving. The station learned that part first. My legs trembled. I hadn't realized how tired I was until that moment. The long hike. The tension. The hours of fear grinding me down. The chair looked impossibly inviting now. My knees ached. My back burned. The idea of sitting, just for a moment, sent a wave of relief through me, so strong it made my vision blur. I took a step back instead. The warmth surged in response, filling the room, wrapping around me like a blanket. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just heat anymore. It was comfort. The kind you feel when you finally lie down after a long, brutal day. When the world narrows to softness and quiet. I shook my head violently, trying to clear it. "You're not real," I said, though the words sounded thin. "You're an echo. A memory." Evan sighed. The sound carried weight. "I was real," he said. "And so are you. That's all it needs." I thought of the logbook. The way his entries had grown shorter toward the end. The way the last one mentioned the chairs again, almost casually, like it had become normal. I realized then that the station didn't take people all at once. It wore them down. Made staying feel easier than leaving. "What happens if I sit?" I asked. The chair creaked softly, as if responding. "At first," Ivan said, "nothing bad. You rest. You feel better. You tell yourself it's just for a minute. The station likes that. It gives you warmth. It makes the silence less sharp. And then, another pause. And then you stop noticing how long you've been sitting." The warmth intensified, pressing against my skin, my chest, my thoughts. I felt my heartbeat slow, my breathing deepen. Every part of me wanted to give in, to take the relief being offered. My flashlight slipped from my fingers and clattered to the floor, the sound distant and unimportant. I clenched my fists until my nails bit into my palms. Pain. I needed pain. "Why are you telling me this?" I demanded. "If it needs me, why warn me?" Evan's presence faltered. The warmth wavered. "Because I didn't have anyone to tell me," he said quietly. "And because it gets louder when you're alone." The radio crackled to life on the desk. I flinched as Evan's voice vanished, replaced by static. The display glowed, numbers flickering. Then a voice cut through the noise. Not Evan's, my own. "Nolan Pierce, Field Ranger reporting," it said. "Station secure. All systems normal." My blood ran cold. The transmission continued. My voice calm and professional, delivering a routine status update dated 6 months in the future. I staggered toward the desk, staring at the radio like it was a mirror, reflecting a future I hadn't lived yet. "That's how it keeps records," Evan said softly, his presence returning, weaker now. "It doesn't fake people. It finishes them." The chair scraped forward, just an inch. I realized then that staying standing wasn't enough. The station didn't need me to sit immediately. It just needed me to stay. To exist inside its walls, long enough for exhaustion to do the rest. I grabbed the logbook and flipped to the last page. My hands shook as I picked up the pen. If this was going to end, I needed proof. Something external. Something that couldn't be rewritten by a warm chair and a quiet voice. I wrote fast, my words uneven. "My name is Nolan Pierce. If you are reading this, do not sit. Do not rest. Do not stay warm. Leave immediately." The warmth spiked violently, like a warning. The chair slammed back against the table, the sound sharp and angry. The radio screeched, my recorded voice overlapping itself in a chaotic loop. Ivan cried out, not in pain but in panic. "It doesn't like that," he said. "You have to go. Now." The door handle was cool when I grabbed it this time. I didn't think. I didn't look back. I yanked the door open and ran, bursting out into the cold night air, like I was breaking the surface of deep water. The chill hit me hard, stealing my breath, but I welcomed it. I kept running, my pack bouncing against my back, my lungs burning. Behind me, the station lights flared to life, every window glowing bright and inviting against the dark forest. I heard chairs scraping inside. Multiple chairs. Dozens of them. Shifting and adjusting, filling the space I had just vacated. Evan's voice followed me into the trees. "Don't stop," he called, fading with distance. "Whatever you do, don't stop." I didn't. I ran until my legs gave out, until the ground rose up and met me, until the cold soaked through my clothes and anchored me in my own body. I lay there gasping, staring up at the indifferent stars, waiting for the warmth to return. It didn't. By morning, the station was dark again. Search teams found it empty, just as it had been 6 months earlier. My logbook entry was still there. So was Evan's jacket. The chairs were cold. They reassigned the post 2 weeks later. I filed my report. Most of it was redacted. Some things don't fit into official language. I still feel it sometimes, though. When I sit too long. When a chair feels just a little too comfortable. And I stand up immediately. Because somewhere out there, Station K-17 is still waiting, patient as ever, confident that eventually, someone will choose to rest. My name is Caleb Morris. I am 34 years old. Employed as a seasonal wilderness operations technician under contract with the Regional Land Management Authority, and, as of this morning, I was reassigned to Outpost E-17 due to an unexpected staffing shortage. I am recording this account because the events today do not align with standard explanations, and because writing has always been my method of maintaining clarity when fatigue, isolation, and stress begin to blur judgment. Everything described here occurred within a single operational day, beginning shortly after my arrival and ending just before dawn. Outpost E-17 sits roughly 14 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a deteriorating service trail that has not been officially maintained in years. The structure itself is modest, one main room, a compact kitchen area, a radio desk bolted to the wall, a storage closet, and a sleeping nook partitioned by a half wall. It is designed for short rotations, never more than one staff member at a time. I was informed that the previous technician had been relocated due to health concerns. A phrase vague enough to discourage further questions. The transfer paperwork was clean. No incident reports, no flagged anomalies. Just a signature, a date, and an instruction to occupy the post for a single overnight cycle before relief arrived tomorrow afternoon. I arrived shortly after 13:40 hours. The weather was unremarkable for the season. Overcast, cool, the forest floor damp from rainfall earlier in the week. I performed the usual exterior inspection first, checking the solar array, fuel lock, and antenna tension. Everything appeared intact. No signs of forced entry, no damage to the door or windows. The mud around the building showed animal tracks typical for the region: deer, raccoon. Something smaller I didn't bother to identify. Nothing unusual enough to log. Inside, the outpost smelled faintly of wet wood and old coffee. The power indicator was green. The radio hummed quietly. The logbook sat open on the desk, last entry time stamped 3 days prior. I skimmed it without much interest. Routine weather observations, trail condition notes, nothing out of place. I signed my name beneath the last entry, noted the time of arrival, and set my pack down near the bunk. I did not notice the footprints immediately. The first several hours passed uneventfully. I completed equipment checks, verified the emergency beacon, and performed a scheduled radio call in at 1600. Signal was clear. No anomalies reported. As evening approached, the forest grew quiet, in the way it often does before nightfall. the ambient sounds thinning rather than stopping outright. I prepared a simple meal, ate standing near the counter, and reviewed the next day's handoff procedures. It was around 19:10 when I went to retrieve my spare socks from the bunk area and noticed the marks on the floor. They were muddy boot prints. At first, my brain supplied the obvious explanation. I must have tracked mud in earlier without realizing it. But that assumption unraveled almost immediately. I had removed my boots at the door, as I always do, and the prints were not random or overlapping. They were clear, deliberate impressions, deep enough to show tread pattern, spaced evenly, as if made by someone walking calmly. What unsettled me most was their orientation. The prints did not begin at the door. They began near the radio desk, where I had been sitting earlier, and continued in a straight line across the floor toward the bunk. They ended at the foot of the bed. There were no return prints, no partial smears, no indication of hesitation or change in direction. Just a single set of muddy boots, walking from the center of the room to where I slept. I stood there for several seconds, staring at them, waiting for the sense of unreality to dissolve. I checked my own boots. They were still by the door, clean except for a thin layer of dried dirt on the soles. The tread pattern did not match the prints on the floor. The size was wrong too, slightly larger, heavier. I told myself it was stress, fatigue from the hike in, a trick of the light. Still, I fetched my flashlight and followed the prints carefully, scanning for where they might have come from. There were no marks near the windows, no disturbance near the storage closet. The door threshold was clean. The prints simply existed, as if they had formed out of the damp air itself. I wiped one partially with a cloth. The mud smeared realistically, leaving residue on the fabric. It was real, cold, fresh enough that it hadn't fully dried. I checked the time. 19:26. The rational response would have been to contact base immediately. Instead, I hesitated. There was no protocol for unexplained footprints inside a sealed structure. Reporting it would require explanations I didn't have, and part of me feared sounding irrational over an open channel. So I documented it privately in my notebook, noted the dimensions, the direction, the location, and decided to monitor the situation. I cleaned the floor thoroughly. By 2100, the prints were gone. The outpost looked normal again. I double-checked all locks, performed another radio call, routine, uneventful, and prepared for sleep. The forest outside had gone completely dark, the overcast sky absorbing what little moonlight there might have been. I lay on the bunk, listening to the subtle creaks of the structure adjusting to the temperature drop. Sometime later, I woke abruptly. I do not know what caused it. There was no sound, no dream that I could recall. Just the sudden certainty of being alert, heart racing, senses sharp. I checked my watch. 2:14. I sat up and reached instinctively for my flashlight. That was when I saw them again. Fresh muddy boot prints covered the floor. They were darker this time, wetter, more defined, and they led only one way. From the center of the room, straight to my bunk, stopping inches from where my feet rested. I stayed sitting upright on the bunk for several minutes, breathing slowly through my nose, holding the flashlight steady as if the beam itself were a barrier. The prints did not change. They did not fade or spread. They simply existed, terminating at the exact point where my boots would touch the floor when I stood up. I remember thinking how precise that felt, how intentional. Whoever. Whatever had walked there to lay out of the outpost well, enough to stop exactly where I would normally step. I forced myself to stand. My feet avoided the impressions instinctively, landing on the narrow strip of clean floor beside the bed. The cold of the concrete seeped through my socks. I swept the flashlight beam slowly across the room, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing moved. The door was still locked from the inside. The windows were sealed, their latches undisturbed. Outside, the forest was motionless, black trunks rising into darker sky. I crouched and touched one of the prints with my fingertips. The mud was wet, not damp, wet enough to cling to my skin. I rubbed my fingers together, feeling grit and organic debris. Pine needles, soil, something fibrous I couldn't identify. It smelled like the forest floor after heavy rain. Fresh, recent. My watch read Zo2C19. I had been asleep less than 5 hours. There was no rational explanation that fit the evidence in front of me, but I still tried to assemble one. Sleepwalking didn't account for the size mismatch. An intruder didn't explain the locked door or the absence of exit tracks. An animal couldn't have produced boot-shaped impressions with uniform tread. I documented everything again, more thoroughly this time. Measurements, moisture level, orientation. I photographed the prints with my phone, placing a pen beside them for scale. The flash illuminated the room harshly, flattening the shadows, making the outpost feel smaller, more claustrophobic. When I finished, I cleaned the floor again, scrubbing harder than before, until my hands ached and the smell of wet earth was replaced by disinfectant. I disposed of the rags in a sealed trash bag and set it outside the door, breaking protocol without really caring anymore. I did not go back to sleep. I sat at the radio desk instead, back straight, eyes fixed on the door, listening to the quiet. The outpost made its usual noises, wood contracting, metal ticking softly, but every sound felt amplified. I checked the time repeatedly, counting the minutes until first light. At Vol.47, the radio crackled. I hadn't touched it. The sound was brief, a burst of static followed by a low hum, as if someone had keyed the microphone and let go immediately. I leaned forward, heart pounding, and adjusted the volume. "Base, this is Outpost E17, I said, keeping my voice controlled. Radio check. Silence. I waited, finger hovering over the transmit button. The seconds stretched. I was about to release it when the speaker emitted another sound. Not static this time, but a faint rhythmic noise, like breathing too close to a microphone. I froze. The breathing continued for 3 full seconds, then stopped abruptly. I logged the incident. Duration. Description. I did not attempt another call. Something about the way the sound had come through felt wrong. Not distorted or distant as radio interference usually is, but intimate, as if the source were inside the room with me. As Zo4N12, I noticed the smell again. Wet earth. It was faint at first, just a suggestion beneath the disinfectant, but it grew steadily stronger. I stood, flashlight in hand, and scanned the floor. New prints had appeared. These were different. The tread pattern was the same, but the spacing had changed. Shorter steps, closer together, as if whoever made them had been walking slowly, carefully. They began near the door this time. Not at the threshold, but several feet inside the room, and circled the bunk. They did not approach it directly. They went around it, one full rotation, then another half, stopping at the head of the bed. I felt a tightness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. I backed away until my shoulders touched the wall, keeping the beam fixed on the prints, waiting for them to do something else. They didn't. They remained as they were, silent evidence of movement that had already happened. I did not clean them. Something about their placement stopped me. A primitive part of my brain insisted that erasing them would make things worse, that acknowledging them without interference was safer. Instead, I marked their edges with tape, outlining their positions, creating a crude map of where they lay. Dawn crept in slowly, a pale gray light filtering through the windows, softening the room without making it feel any less oppressive. When the sun finally rose above the trees, the prints were still there unchanged. At 07:30, I received a scheduled call from base. E-17. This is operations. Morning check. I answered immediately, relief flooding my voice despite my effort to stay professional. Operations. This is Morris. I need to report an incident. There was a pause. Then, go ahead. I described everything. The initial discovery, the repeated appearances, the radio interference. I stuck to observable facts, avoided speculation, kept my tone neutral. Another pause. Copy that. Operations said finally. Stand by. I waited, listening to the low hiss of the channel. Morris. The voice returned. Quieter now. Can you confirm you are alone at the outpost? Yes. And you secured the door upon arrival? Yes. Understood. Remain at the outpost. Relief will be delayed. Delayed. I repeated, the word tasting wrong. Affirmative. We're reviewing records related to E-17. We'll update you when we have more information. The channel went dead. I stared at the radio, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. Reviewing records meant there was history here. History they hadn't told me about. I looked back at the prints circling my bunk, at the careful way they avoided stepping where I lay. Whatever had been walking inside this outpost hadn't been lost. It had been waiting. After the radio went silent, the outpost felt smaller than it had all night, as if the walls had subtly shifted inward, while I wasn't looking. I stood there longer than I realized, staring at the speaker, half expecting it to crackle back to life on its own. It didn't. The only sound was the faint wind moving through the trees outside, and the low electrical hum of the solar inverter. I made myself breathe evenly and focus on procedure. Panic would not help. Documentation might. I photographed the new arrangement of prints again, capturing the way they curved around the bunk, the unnatural deliberateness of their spacing. In daylight, they looked even more wrong. Night had at least offered the excuse of shadow. Morning stripped that away. At 08:15. I stepped outside for the first time since discovering the second set. The air was cold and damp, fog hanging low between the trees. The ground around the outpost was soft, churned with animal tracks and my own boot prints from the previous afternoon. I scanned carefully for anything that matched the tread inside. There was nothing. No matching impressions. No disturbed soil near the foundation. No tracks approaching or leaving the structure. The mud inside had come from the forest floor, but the forest showed no sign of having given it. I circled the building twice, widening the radius each time, moving slowly despite the growing urge to rush. Still nothing. It was as if the outpost existed in isolation from the land around it, a sealed bubble where normal rules ended. When I returned inside, the smell of wet earth was stronger than before. The prints had changed again. They no longer circled the bunk. They led to it. One set of steps approached from the center of the room and stopped at the head of the bed. Another set, identical in size and tread, stood at the foot. The distance between them was precise, measured. Whoever had stood there had positioned themselves exactly where a person would stand to look down at someone lying on the mattress. I felt an involuntary surge of anger then, sharp and surprising. Fear I could manage. Confusion too. But this felt invasive in a way that cut deeper. I grabbed the radio. Operations, this is E17. I need immediate clarification. Static answered me. Then, faintly, the same breathing sound from earlier. Closer this time, wet and uneven. Like lungs struggling against thick air. I slammed the transmit button down. Who is this? The breathing stopped. For a moment, I thought that was it. Then the radio clicked, and a voice came through, low and calm. Morris. It was my name. Pronounced correctly. Familiar. Yes, I said automatically, before I could stop myself. You cleaned the floor. The voice continued. My stomach dropped. Identify yourself. Silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the transmission had cut out. Then, we don't like it when you erase us. The voice was not distorted. It sounded as though the speaker were standing just outside the outpost, talking through the thin walls. I backed away from the desk, heart pounding, eyes locked on the prints by the bunk. You're not on my channel, I said. This frequency is restricted. A faint sound came through then, not words but movement. Something like slow footsteps on a hard surface, timed evenly, deliberately. We've always been here, the voice said. You're the one who arrived. The radio went dead. I did not attempt to contact operations again. I packed my gear with shaking hands, moving as quickly as I could without dropping anything. Protocol dictated that I remain until relief arrived, but protocol had already failed me. I slung my pack over my shoulder and moved toward the door, careful not to step on the prints as I passed. My hand closed around the handle. Behind me, something shifted. Not a sound exactly, but a change in pressure, like the room had exhaled. I turned slowly. A new set of prints had appeared between the bunk and the door, fresher than the rest, mud glistening wetly. They were close together, heels nearly touching toes, as if whoever made them had been standing still for a long time, blocking the exit. I'm leaving, I said aloud, unsure why I bothered. The smell of wet earth surged, overwhelming now, filling my lungs. My vision swam. For a terrifying second, I was certain I would pass out and wake up back on the bunk, surrounded. Instead, the radio crackled one last time. You can, the voice said, but you'll bring it with you. The prints near the door began to smear, not fading but dragging backward, clearing a narrow path. An invitation. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the door open and stepped outside into the fog, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't lock it. I didn't look back. I followed the service trail at a near run, branches tearing at my sleeves, lungs burning. I did not stop until I reached my vehicle. When I finally did look back, the outpost was barely visible through the trees, already swallowed by mist. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement near the door, a darker shape against the gray. But then the fog thickened and it was gone. I drove straight through, ignoring the rough road, the warning lights on my dashboard, the ache in my hands from gripping the wheel too tightly. Operations contacted me hours later, demanding an explanation for my abandonment of post. I gave them one. They suspended me pending review. 2 days after that, I received an email. Outpost E17 had been permanently decommissioned. No reason given. Last night I woke to the smell of wet earth in my apartment. This morning, I found muddy boot prints on my bedroom floor. They don't lead to the door. They lead to my bed. My name is Aaron Whitlock, and at the time these events took place, I was employed as a night facility supervisor for a regional archival complex located several miles outside the nearest town. The building was not abandoned, not forgotten, and not officially classified as hazardous or restricted beyond standard security protocol. On paper, it was simply a climate-controlled storage site for outdated municipal records, equipment inventories, and items deemed too obsolete to remain on active premises. I accepted the position because it offered solitude, predictable hours, and a level of quiet that appealed to someone like me, someone who preferred order, documentation, and routine over conversation. On my first day, during the formal orientation, I was given a binder outlining procedures. Most of it was unremarkable: fire suppression systems, emergency exits, radio check-ins, generator failovers. Near the end, however, my supervisor paused, lowered his voice slightly, and added a verbal instruction that did not appear anywhere in the documentation. He told me that there was a locked storage room in the sublevel corridor, and that under no circumstances was I to open it after midnight. He did not say why. He only repeated the rule, made sure I acknowledged it, and then moved on, as if he had warned me not to lean back in a chair. At the time, I assumed it was either an insurance requirement or a poorly explained security measure. I did not press him for details. I had no reason to. I had worked night shifts before, and every building seemed to have its own myths. Rooms that weren't safe, switches you weren't supposed to touch, stories told half seriously to discourage curiosity. I signed the acknowledgement, took my access badge, and began my first overnight shift that same week. The building at night was quieter than I expected, not silent but controlled. The HVAC systems cycled at regular intervals. The hum of electrical panels was steady and reassuring. Motion-activated lights activated precisely when they were supposed to, illuminating long corridors of metal shelving and sealed containers. I conducted hourly rounds, logged temperature readings, and checked door seals. Everything behaved as designed. Shortly before midnight, I reached the sublevel corridor for the first time. It was narrower than the others and noticeably colder, even accounting for the climate controls. At the far end stood a reinforced steel door with no signage beyond a small stenciled number. It had a physical lock in addition to an electronic access panel, and unlike the rest of the facility, the panel was inactive. No card reader, no keypad, just metal paint and a keyhole. I remembered the instruction immediately. I did not approach the door. I noted its condition in my log: unchanged, sealed, no visible damage, and continued my rounds. Midnight passed without incident. I checked in over the radio as required and resumed my routine. I did not think about the storage room again until just after 1 in the morning, when I heard a sound that did not fit the building's usual rhythm. It was not loud. It was not sudden. It was the sound of metal shifting against metal, followed by a dull, hollow thud, as if something inside a container had settled after being disturbed. I stopped walking and listened. The sound came again, faint but deliberate, from below my position, from the sublevel corridor. I stood still for a full minute, listening for alarms or alerts. None activated. The system logs on my handheld unit showed no changes, no door breaches, no pressure fluctuations. Everything registered as normal. I considered the possibility of thermal expansion or a misaligned shelf. Old buildings make noises. That is a fact I trusted more than my instincts. I descended to the sublevel corridor anyway, telling myself that part of my responsibility was to investigate anomalies, even minor ones. The lights activated as I approached, and the corridor appeared exactly as it had earlier. The reinforced door at the far end remained closed. The lock was intact. The floor was clear. I logged the sound as unidentified mechanical noise, source inconclusive, and turned to leave. That was when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the sterile scent of filtered air. But the longer I stood there, the more apparent it became. Not decay, not chemicals. Something organic, warm, and out of place. Like fabric that had been stored too long in a sealed space with a living presence. I checked the ventilation grates along the corridor wall. They were unobstructed. Airflow was within normal parameters. I did not open the locked door. I want to be very clear about that. I followed the instruction exactly as it had been given to me. I did not touch the lock. I did not attempt entry. I did not even place my hand on the door. I finished my shift without further incident. Though the smell lingered in my mind, long after return to the main level. The second half of the night passed more slowly. I found myself listening more, carefully to every sound, reading more into each mechanical click and pressure change. Around 3 in the morning, I noticed something else. My access logs showed a door cycle in the sublevel corridor, timestamped at 2017 AM. The system registered it as internal. Not forced, not manual. Just a door state change, closed to open, then open to closed within 30 seconds. There was only one door in that corridor. I radioed the central office immediately, reporting a possible system error. The operator confirmed that no maintenance teams were scheduled and no remote access commands had been issued. He suggested a software glitch and told me to annotate it for review. I did as instructed, though the explanation did not sit comfortably with me. Software errors do not usually align so neatly with specific warnings. I returned to the sublevel corridor one final time before the end of my shift. The air felt heavier there, as if the space had recently been occupied. The smell was stronger now, unmistakable, layered with something metallic and sharp. The reinforced door remained closed, the lock unchanged, but there were marks on the floor directly in front of it. Scuffed arcs, as if something heavy had shifted position repeatedly. I did not cross the threshold. I did not approach the door. I stood several feet away, documenting everything visually and in writing. As I did, I heard a sound from the other side of the metal barrier. Not a voice, not a knock. A slow, deliberate movement, as though something inside was adjusting itself, aware of my presence, responding without making a demand. At exactly 5:00 AM, my shift ended. I left the building on schedule, turned in my logs, and drove home as the sun began to rise. I told myself that what I had experienced was explainable, that every system had a flaw, and that warnings were often exaggerated for liability reasons. I slept poorly that day, dreaming of confined spaces and doors that open without being touched. I returned the following night, prepared to follow the rules as I always had, convinced that compliance was enough to keep me safe. I did not know then that the rule was never about whether I opened the locked storage room after midnight. It was about acknowledging that something inside did not require my permission. I arrived for my second shift earlier than usual, deliberately so. with the intention of reviewing the previous night's logs before the building transitioned fully into its overnight cycle. I told myself that familiarity would dull the unease, that repetition would reassert control. I reread my own notes carefully, paying attention to the language I had used. Unidentified mechanical noise. Unscheduled internal door cycle. The phrasing was neutral. Professional, deliberately restrained. It did nothing to capture the way my hands had trembled when I typed it. The day's supervisor skimmed my report without comment. When I asked whether maintenance had reviewed the sublevel door anomaly, he hesitated for a fraction of a second too long before telling me it had been forwarded. He did not meet my eyes. He did not offer reassurance. He simply reminded me again never to open the locked storage room after midnight. The way he said it made it sound less like a rule and more like a boundary he was afraid to approach himself. That night, I followed my routine exactly as written. I checked every system twice. I logged readings at shorter intervals. I avoided the sublevel corridor until after midnight, telling myself there was no operational need to be there earlier. When the clock reached 12:01 a.m., I was standing at the main console, watching the building's status indicators cycle green across the screen. At 12:04, the internal sensors registered a temperature fluctuation in the sublevel corridor. Minor but distinct. A localized drop, as though cold air had been released suddenly and then contained. The ventilation system did not activate in response. According to the readouts, it had not needed to. I did not go down immediately. Instead, I monitored the data remotely, hoping for a rational explanation to present itself. It did not. At 12:19, the same door log appeared again. Closed to open, open to closed. 27 seconds this time. I felt a tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. The building was behaving as if the door were being used. Not breached, not forced. Used. Against my better judgment, I descended to the sublevel corridor. The air hit me first. It was colder than before, and the smell had intensified into something layered and oppressive, like damp cloth. Iron and old insulation soaked through with heat. The lights activated sluggishly, as if delayed by resistance rather than circuitry. The reinforced door stood at the end of the corridor, unchanged in appearance, but the marks on the floor were no longer confined to a small area. They spread outward now, overlapping arcs and straight lines, as though something inside had been dragged forward and repositioned repeatedly. I noticed, with growing dread, that some of the marks extended away from the door, toward the center of the corridor, before stopping abruptly. I did not cross them. I documented everything from a distance, forcing my breathing to remain steady, reminding myself that I was observing, not participating. As I lifted my handheld unit to photograph the floor, I heard movement again from the other side of the door. Slower this time. Heavier. The sound of weight settling, followed by a faint scraping noise that suggested contact with the metal barrier itself. Then, very softly, I heard a click. It was not the sound of the physical lock turning. I knew that sound. This was internal, muted, like the engagement of a secondary mechanism. My handheld unit vibrated in my grip as the system registered another door state change. Closed to open. The door did not move. For a moment, nothing happened. The system continued to insist that the door was open, even as my eyes confirmed that it remained sealed. Then the smell surged forward, escaping through seams I had not noticed before. The air grew thick enough to taste, metallic and warm, clinging to the back of my throat. I took a step back. I did not run. I did not speak. I simply retreated until I reached the stairwell and ascended to the main level, where the air felt thin and clean by comparison. I reported the anomaly immediately. My voice measured, my language precise. The operator acknowledged the report and placed me on hold. I waited longer than expected. When the line reconnected, the operator informed me that my report had been escalated and that I was to remain at my station unless instructed otherwise. I asked whether anyone was coming on site. He paused, then said that no one would arrive before morning. I did not ask why. The rest of the night passed in a stint of suspended tension. I remained at the main console, monitoring the sublevel corridor remotely. The system continued to log activity around the door at irregular intervals. Each time, the door state changed without any visible movement. Each time, the internal sensors adjusted as if accommodating a presence. At 3:42 a.m., a new data point appeared. Motion detected. Not in the corridor. Inside the storage room, I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to reconcile the information. There were no motion sensors inside that room. According to the facility schematics, the space was unmonitored by design. And yet the system insisted on tracking something, plotting slow, deliberate movements within a space that should have been inert. The motion pattern was erratic but purposeful. It approached the door, paused, retreated, then returned again, each time lingering longer near the threshold. I felt an overwhelming sense of being studied, not directly, but through the systems I relied on to impose order. As if whatever was inside had learned how to announce itself without crossing the barrier. At 4:15, the lights in the sublevel corridor activated on their own. I did not authorize them. No motion was detected outside the door. The corridor remained empty. But the lights stayed on, illuminating the space fully, brightly, insistently. I understood then that this was not a malfunction. It was a request. I refused it. I remained at my post until the end of my shift, documenting every anomaly, every deviation, every impossible reading. When morning came, I left the building without returning to the sublevel corridor. I submitted my report in person, insisting on a review, on answers, on acknowledgement that something was wrong. The supervisor accepted the report without comment. He did not ask me to clarify. He did not challenge my conclusions. He only told me, quietly, that if I intended to continue working nights, I needed to understand something. The rule was not meant to keep what was inside contained. It was meant to establish a pattern, a way of knowing who respected the boundary and who could be approached differently. I went home that morning with the distinct feeling that the building was not done with me. That something inside the locked storage room had noticed my refusal, had recorded it the same way I recorded system logs, and was adjusting its expectations accordingly. By the time I returned for what would become my final shift, I had already decided that I would not stay long. I told myself I needed one more night only to confirm that the pattern was real, that the escalation I believed I was seeing was not the product of exhaustion or imagination. I brought a personal recorder with me, separate from the facility systems, and kept it running from the moment I stepped inside. I wanted a record that did not belong to the building. The atmosphere felt different immediately. The air was warmer than it should have been, thick with a faint metallic scent that had no place in a controlled environment. The lights flickered once as I passed through the main entrance. Not a failure, but a hesitation, like something registering my arrival. I checked in over the radio, received the usual acknowledgement, and took my place at the console. Nothing happened for the first hour. No alerts, no door cycles, no temperature fluctuations. The silence felt deliberate, rehearsed. I logged routine readings with mechanical precision, forcing my mind into familiar motions. Midnight came and went without incident. I began to wonder if the previous night had been a final warning, a display meant to test my response rather than provoke it. At 12:37 a.m., every system on my screen refreshed simultaneously. Not rebooted. Refreshed. The data repopulated faster than normal, lines snapping into place with unsettling efficiency. Before I could process what I was seeing, a new status indicator appeared beside the sublevel corridor door. It had not existed before. The label was simple, utilitarian, and deeply wrong. ACCS PDNG. I stood from my chair slowly, my pulse loud in my ears. I did not touch the console. I did not authorize anything. The system timestamp updated again. ACIS reclusi KNOGALA. The building was no longer behaving as a passive structure. It was participating. I grabbed my radio and called the central office. There was no response. I tried again on a secondary channel. Static answered me, followed by a faint, irregular clicking sound that did not match any known interference pattern. I shut the radio off. The lights dimmed throughout the facility, not failing but lowering uniformly, as if conserving power. Emergency systems did not engage. The building considered this state acceptable. Against every instinct I had left, I moved toward the stairwell leading to the sublevel corridor. I needed to see it one last time. I needed confirmation that what I feared was real, even if it meant placing myself closer to it than I ever had before. The steps felt longer than usual, the air growing heavier with each level. I descended. The corridor lights were already on when I reached the bottom. The reinforced door was no longer flush with the frame. It had not opened, but it had shifted, bulging outward slightly, as though pressure from within had reshaped it over time. The floor marks now extended the full width of the corridor, layered and chaotic, evidence of repeated attempts to occupy space that did not belong to it. I stopped several feet away, my recorder capturing the sound of my breathing, the hum of the lights, the faint, wet scrape coming from the other side of the door. The smell was overwhelming now, a mix of heat, iron, and something unmistakably human. The system chimed softly behind me. A CCS guarantee. The physical lock did not turn. Instead, the door responded as if it no longer required it. The metal flexed, seams widening with a groan that vibrated through the floor and into my bones. I stumbled backward as the door opened inward, not swung, but pulled aside by something that understood leverage better than hinges. I did not see everything at once. My mind could not process it that way. I registered movement first, then mass, then shape that refused to settle into anything familiar. The storage room was far larger inside than it should have been, its walls stretched and bowed, shelves twisted into useless forms. And within it was something that had learned to exist by rearranging what it was given. It had no single outline. Parts of it pressed against the threshold, testing the space beyond, while other parts remained behind, anchored, reluctant. It moved with purpose, not urgency, as if this moment had been anticipated for a very long time. I understood, with sickening clarity, that it had never needed me to open the door. It had needed me to be present when it did. The lights flickered again, briefly illuminating surfaces that looked worn smooth by contact, as though the thing inside had practiced this approach countless times. I backed away, my heel catching on a floor mark I had refused to cross before. I fell hard, the recorder skidding from my hand. The sound it made when it touched the corridor floor was not dramatic. It was quiet, almost careful. The thing adjusted itself, compressing, expanding, learning the resistance of open space. I scrambled backward, dragging myself toward the stairwell, my body moving faster than my thoughts. It did not chase me, it followed, slowly, confidently, each movement deliberate, measured, as if it were cataloging the building the way it had once cataloged system logs. I reached the stairs and climbed, not looking back, not daring to confirm how much of it had crossed the threshold. When I reached the main level, the building felt different again. Warmer. Occupied. The lights brightened behind me, one section at a time, marking its progress upward. I ran to the console, my hands shaking as I searched for anything. Locks, overrides, alarms. There were none. The system interface had changed. New indicators filled the screen, mapping movement through areas that had never been tracked before. It was learning faster now, adapting to freedom with unsettling efficiency. One line of text blinked at the center of the display. Stior ag reuel located. I did the only thing I could think to do. I left. I ran through the building, ignoring protocol, ignoring procedure, ignoring the part of my mind that still wanted to document instead of survive. I reached the exit just as the lights behind me reached full brightness. I did not hear it anymore. That terrified me more than any sound it had made. I drove until dawn without stopping. I never returned to the facility. I resigned by email, citing personal reasons. No one responded. Weeks later, I received a notice that the site had been temporarily closed for structural reassessment. The building still appears on public records. It still draws power. It still employs someone for the night shift. Sometimes, just after midnight, I wake with the smell of metal and heat in my nose, and the certainty that something is logging my absence, that it learned something from me, that I was never warned because opening the door was the danger. I was warned because one day, inevitably, it would open itself. My name is Thomas Hale. I am stating that plainly and formally because accuracy matters when records are involved, and this account is, at its core, a record. I was assigned to Outpost Delta 7 at 06:40 in the morning, a remote wilderness monitoring station positioned deep inside federally protected land. The assignment was temporary, 1 day only. A routine equipment check, inventory verification, and overnight presence to satisfy protocol requirements. Nothing more. I arrived alone. The road ended miles before the outpost. From there, the remaining distance had to be covered on foot, following a narrow service trail that hadn't seen fresh maintenance in months. The air was cold and still, the kind of silence that presses inward rather than simply existing. No wind through the trees, no birds, no insects. Just the sound of my own breathing and the dull crunch of boots against gravel and frozen soil. The outpost came into view just after noon. A single-story reinforced structure, weathered but intact, sitting in a clearing that felt unnaturally precise, as if the forest had been pushed back by force rather than cut away. Antenna mast intact. Solar panels angled correctly. No visible damage. No signs of forced entry. The door was unlocked. That by itself wasn't unusual. Rangers rotated through these sites regularly, and locking procedures were often ignored in low-risk zones. Still, I noted it. Habit, documentation mentality. I logged everything. Inside, the outpost smelled faintly of metal, dust, and old insulation. The lights worked. The radio powered on. The emergency generator responded properly to a test cycle. Everything was exactly as it should be, down to the neatly organized shelves and the sealed storage lockers along the east wall. I signed in at the logbook, noting time of arrival and weather conditions. Clear skies, low wind, visibility excellent, no anomalies observed. For several hours, that remained true. I worked through the checklist methodically, verifying supplies, testing sensors, and cross-referencing serial numbers. The inventory system was partially digital, partially manual, an outdated hybrid that required manual confirmation at the end of the day. I didn't mind. It gave structure to the time. By late afternoon, I had settled into the rhythm of the place. Isolation loses its edge when it becomes predictable. The outpost hummed softly with electrical activity. The radio crackled occasionally with distant, irrelevant chatter from other sectors. I ate a cold ration meal and drank lukewarm water from a sealed bottle. Nothing felt wrong. Sunset came earlier than expected. The light outside shifted abruptly, the forest darkening in uneven layers as shadows stretched across the clearing. I turned on the exterior floodlights and noted their proper function. Again, everything normal. I began the final task shortly after 19 Hausers. Inventory reconciliation. The system required confirmation of all present assets, consumables, and personnel. Personnel was usually straightforward. Most outposts listed capacity for 2 to 4 occupants, even if only one was assigned. The line item was typically pre-filled and adjusted as needed. I accessed the terminal and opened the inventory list. At first, I assumed it was a formatting error. Under Personnel Status, the screen displayed a single column labeled Currently Breathing. There were 2 entries, Thomas Hale, and one more. No name. Just a placeholder designation, the way unfinished records sometimes appeared when data hadn't synced correctly. I frowned and refreshed the screen. The entry remained. I checked the personnel assignment file. Only my name appeared. No overlapping shifts. No emergency reassignment. No notes. I told myself it was a system glitch. That explanation held for approximately 30 seconds. I performed a full manual count of the outpost. Every room, every storage area, every maintenance crawl space and exterior access panel. The building was small enough that this took less than 10 minutes. I found no signs of another person. No personal gear. No disturbed dust. No warmth lingering in unused spaces. When I returned to the terminal, the inventory still listed 2 under Currently Breathing. I deleted the second entry. The system accepted the change. I watched the screen for a moment longer than necessary, waiting for it to revert. It didn't. Satisfied, or at least willing to proceed. I completed the remaining checks and finalized the report. The generator cycled automatically at 2100, causing a brief flicker in the lights. I barely noticed at the time. The first sound occurred shortly after. It was subtle, a shift in pressure, the kind of noise that could be explained away as thermal expansion or structural settling. I paused, listening, then dismissed it. Old buildings make noise. Remote buildings make more. I prepared my sleeping area on the narrow bunk near the west wall. Boots off. Jacket folded. Radio volume lowered but not muted. Protocol advised against full silence. As I lay there, staring up at the dim ceiling lights, I felt an unfamiliar tension settle into my chest. Not fear. Something closer to awareness. The sense that I was being observed, not directly, but indirectly, as if by the environment itself. I checked my watch, 22:17. I told myself to sleep. That was when the terminal chimed. I sat up immediately. The sound wasn't an alarm, just a notification tone, the same one used when inventory values changed. I crossed the room quickly, pulse steady but elevated. The screen glowed softly in the dark. The inventory list was open. Under personnel status, the second entry had returned, still unnamed, still listed as currently breathing. I didn't touch the keyboard right away. Instead, I listened. The outpost was silent. Too silent. Even the generator's hum felt distant, muffled. I realized then that I could hear my own breathing clearly, each inhale and exhale sounding louder than it should in the confined space. I leaned closer to the screen. A new timestamp appeared next to the second entry, updated moments ago. I checked the system logs. No remote access. No automated processes scheduled at that time. No errors reported. My reflection stared back at me from the darkened monitor edges, pale and drawn. I swallowed and reached for the radio, pressing the transmit button. "This is Outpost Delta 7, I said, keeping my voice level. "Personnel count discrepancy. Requesting confirmation from Sector Control." Only static answered. I tried again. Different channel. Same result. I stood there for a long moment, the weight of the silence pressing down harder with each passing second. Then, from somewhere inside the outpost, very close, very controlled, I heard breathing. Not mine. I froze where I stood, my hand still hovering over the radio, my finger resting just short of the transmit switch. The sound was unmistakable now that I allowed myself to recognize it. Slow. Measured. Too deliberate to be mechanical. It came from inside the outpost. Not the walls, not the vents, but somewhere within the same enclosed space as me. Breathing follows patterns. Anyone who has spent time alone learns that. You learn your own rhythm, how it changes when you're tired or stressed. This was not mine. It lagged half a second behind my own inhalations, as if waiting to respond. I held my breath. The sound continued. That was the moment certainty replaced doubt. Whatever the inventory system had detected, whatever it had categorized as currently breathing, was not a clerical error. It was present, and it was close enough to hear. I moved slowly, deliberately, aware that sudden motion might draw attention. My eyes swept the room again, taking in details I had already verified earlier. The bunk, the table, the lockers, the sealed storage cabinet in the corner. All unchanged, all exactly where they should be. The breathing did not shift location when I moved. It remained constant, neither louder nor softer, as if distance meant nothing to it. I retrieved my flashlight from the hook by the door and clicked it on. The beam cut sharply through the dim interior, throwing hard shadows against the walls. Dust motes drifted lazily through the air undisturbed. "Hello," I said, immediately regretting it. My voice sounded too loud, too exposed. The breathing paused. For one brief, horrible second, the outpost was completely silent. Then it resumed. Closer somehow, though nothing had moved. I backed toward the door, my mind racing through protocol. Unknown personnel meant evacuation. Possible intruder meant withdrawal and report. Possible wildlife intrusion meant immediate exit. Every rule pointed to the same conclusion. Leave. I reached for the door handle. Behind me, the terminal chimed again. I turned despite myself. The inventory screen had changed. Under Personnel status. The unnamed entry now displayed a secondary note beneath it. Location interior. My stomach tightened. I felt heat spread across my neck and shoulders, a physical reaction that no amount of training could suppress. I forced myself to breathe steadily, matching my pace to something slower, calmer. "This is Thomas Hale," I said aloud, my words chosen carefully, formally. "I am the assigned operator of this outpost. If someone else is present, identify yourself." The breathing stopped again. This time, it did not resume. The silence stretched elastic and uncomfortable. My ears strained to catch any hint of movement, any sound of footsteps or shifting weight. There was nothing. I waited longer than I should have. Finally, I turned back toward the door and pulled it open. Cold air rushed in, sharp and welcome. The forest beyond was dark, but visible under the floodlights, every tree standing motionless, their shadows long and rigid. No movement. No sign of anyone approaching or leaving. I stepped halfway outside, scanning the perimeter. That was when the inventory chimed again. I spun back inside. The screen refreshed automatically, the text rearranging itself with clinical indifference. The unnamed entry remained, but the location field had updated. Location behind operator. I did not turn around. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to comply. My muscles locked, my pulse thundering so loudly in my ears that it drowned out everything else. The air behind me felt heavier, warmer, as if something substantial occupied the space just inches away from my back. I could feel it breathing now. Each exhale brushed faintly against the fabric of my jacket, subtle but undeniable. Not hot, not cold. Just present, I spoke without moving. "You are not authorized to be here." The words sounded absurd the moment they left my mouth, but they were all I had. There was no reply, no voice. Only the breathing, steady and patient, as if it had all the time in the world. The radio crackled suddenly, erupting into static so loud it made me flinch. I seized the opportunity, spinning and raising the flashlight. There was nothing there. No figure. No shadow. Just empty space where the sensation had been moments earlier. The breathing vanished with it, leaving only the sharp ringing in my ears. I stumbled back against the table, heart racing, lungs burning. The inventory terminal chimed one last time. The unnamed entry was gone. Personnel status listed only one. Thomas Hale. I didn't trust it. I grabbed my pack, my keys, and my jacket, abandoning protocol entirely. I stepped outside fully, pulling the door shut behind me and locking it with shaking hands. The night air felt thinner, colder, but safer than the space I had just left. I took 3 steps away from the outpost before stopping. Through the reinforced window, I could see the terminal screen glowing faintly in the dark interior. The inventory list refreshed. 2 entries appeared, both named Thomas Hale. Thomas Hale. One marked outside. One marked currently breathing inside. I stared at the window longer than was healthy, waiting for one of the entries to disappear. Waiting for the system to correct itself the way machines are supposed to when confronted with something impossible. It didn't. The screen inside the outpost glowed steadily, indifferent to my fear, displaying 2 identical names, as if duplication were an acceptable state of reality. I backed away from the building, without turning my eyes from it, my boots sinking slightly into the cold soil. The forest beyond the floodlights remained perfectly still. No wind, no wildlife, no distant sounds of the night doing what nights normally do. It felt staged, like a photograph that had been left out too long and lost all depth. I checked my watch. 23:41. The assignment was supposed to end at 0700. Sector protocol allowed early withdrawal in the event of credible threat. This qualified. I keyed the radio again, cycling through emergency channels, my voice tight but controlled as I transmitted my identification and situation. "This is Thomas Hale at Delta 7. I said I am requesting immediate extraction. Personnel anomaly confirmed. Inventory system indicates duplicate operator presence. Repeat, duplicate operator presence." The radio hissed. A faint click. Then silence. I lowered it slowly. The quiet pressed in harder now, not just around me, but inside my head. I could feel my thoughts stretching, thinning, as if something were listening to them the way a hand listens for vibrations through a wall. I made the decision to leave on foot. The trail back to the service road would take hours in daylight, longer at night, but staying was no longer an option. I adjusted my pack straps, turned away from the outpost, and took my first step into the trees. The floodlights shut off behind me. I stopped immediately, heart lurching. I turned back. The outpost stood dark and featureless, its windows black, its shape barely distinguishable from the forest beyond. Only the antenna mast caught the starlight, a thin line pointing upward like an accusation. From inside, something moved. I couldn't see it directly, but the darkness shifted, as if the absence of light itself had weight. Then the door unlocked with a soft, mechanical click. I didn't wait to see it open. I ran. Branches clawed at my jacket as I pushed through the trees, following the faint outline of the trail by memory and instinct. My breathing came hard and fast, loud in my ears, but beneath it, faint, persistent. I could hear another rhythm, matching mine. I forced myself to slow, to listen carefully. The sound adjusted immediately, slowing as well, never quite overlapping, always half a step behind. The realization hit me with cold clarity. It wasn't chasing. It was accompanying. I stopped abruptly. The forest went silent again. I turned slowly, flashlight raised, sweeping the beam across trunks and undergrowth. The light revealed nothing but empty space and long shadows. No footprints. No disturbed leaves. No sign that anyone else had ever been there. "Go back," I said aloud, my voice shaking despite my effort to control it. The radio crackled in my hand. For the first time since sunset, a voice came through. "Thomas Hale," it said. It was my voice. Same cadence. Same inflection. Same subtle hesitation before the second syllable of my last name. I lowered the radio as if it had burned me. From directly behind me, close enough that I felt the air move, I heard breathing again. I stayed. The voice said softly, no longer coming from the radio. "You don't have to." I didn't turn around. I already knew what I would see if I did. "This outpost needs someone." It continued calm and reasonable. "The inventory has to be accurate. There has to be someone currently breathing." Not vision blurred. Not from tears, but from the strain of holding myself together. I could feel my sense of self thinning, like a label peeling away from its surface. I understood then that this wasn't about duplication. It was about replacement. I took one step forward. The breathing behind me deepened. I took another. The sound did not follow. I ran again. Harder this time, ignoring the pain in my lungs, ignoring the branches, ignoring everything except the desperate to put distance between myself and the place that had learned my name too well. The trail eventually widened. Gravel crunched beneath my boots. The service road emerged from the darkness like a promise. I didn't stop until I reached my vehicle, fumbling with the keys until the door finally opened. I climbed inside and locked it, hands shaking violently now. The engine roared to life, impossibly loud in the stillness. Headlights cut through the trees, revealing nothing but empty road. As I drove away, I glanced once in the rearview mirror. Far behind me, at the edge of visibility, the outpost lights turned back on. When I reached sector control at dawn, I filed my report in full. Every detail, every anomaly. They listened without interrupting, faces carefully neutral. When I finished, the supervisor nodded and typed something into the terminal. "That outpost was decommissioned yesterday," he said. "You weren't assigned there." He turned the screen toward me. The inventory record was open. Under personnel status, there was one entry: Thomas Hale, currently breathing. Location Outpost Delta 7. They haven't sent anyone back to check. They don't need to. As of this morning, the inventory is stable. My name is Ryan Fletcher. I am recording this because official incident reports do not allow space for hesitation or fear, or the subtle details that explain why a man follows protocol right up until the moment he doesn't. I was assigned to a remote maintenance outpost in a protected wilderness zone, a low-profile facility whose sole purpose was to monitor weather instruments and keep the backup generator operational in case the primary power relay failed. It was meant to be a single overnight shift, 24 hours at most, before a relief team arrived. I had accepted the assignment without protest. I had worked alone before. I trusted routine. I trusted systems that behaved the same way every time you touched them. The outpost sat at the edge of a clearing carved into dense forest, the trees tall enough that even midday sunlight felt filtered and indirect. The building itself was rectangular, concrete and steel, designed to hold heat in winter and resist animal intrusion year-round. There were no nearby trails, no public access routes, and no reason for anyone to be walking around it after dark. That isolation was the point. Everything about the place emphasized predictability. Even the generator followed a strict schedule, cycling down every 6 hours for inspection and fuel balance checks. I arrived just after sunrise. I logged my name, time, and equipment condition in the ledger. I tested the radio. I checked the perimeter cameras. I performed the first generator shutdown at noon, exactly as instructed. Nothing happened then. The building went quiet in the expected way, a clean silence after the low mechanical growl faded. I stood outside with my clipboard, listening only to wind and distant birds. When the generator came back online, I felt reassured by how ordinary it all was. The second shutdown was scheduled for early evening. By then, the forest had begun to change character. Shadows stretched longer than they should have, pooling between the trees. Sound carried oddly, sometimes too far, sometimes not at all. I told myself this was fatigue, the mind compensating for isolation by inventing significance. I cut power, waited for the generator to spin down, and stepped out again. That was when I heard the footsteps. They were deliberate, not hurried, not heavy. Each step landed with the same spacing and pressure, crunching gravel in a steady rhythm. Left, right, pause, left, right, pause. The sound moved along the outer wall of the building, tracing its perimeter with unsettling precision. I froze, listening, counting the seconds between steps. It matched the patrol cadence drilled into me during my early training years. The same rhythm used during night security sweeps, to conserve energy and maintain awareness. I called out, identifying myself, assuming a lost ranger or maintenance worker had wandered off route. The footsteps did not respond. They did not accelerate or retreat. They continued, circling the building, staying just far enough away that I could not see the source. When the generator automatically restarted, the sound stopped instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. I stood there longer than necessary, heart racing, before convincing myself it was wildlife behaving strangely. Deer, maybe, or echoes distorted by the structure. I logged the incident with neutral language and moved on. The third shutdown occurred after full dark. I debated skipping it, citing safety concerns, but procedure allowed no discretion unless there was confirmed human presence. I followed the rules. I shut the generator down. The footsteps returned immediately. This time they were closer. The gravel shifted right outside the light spill from the doorway. I could hear the faint scuff of fabric, the subtle sound of breath, not quite sensing with exertion. The rhythm remained flawless. Whoever, or whatever, was moving out there never stumbled, never hesitated, never adjusted for terrain. I backed into the building and locked the door, watching the security monitor as the camera feeds cycled. None of the cameras showed movement. The audio sensors registered nothing. When the generator powered back up, the footsteps stopped again. I did not sleep that night. I reviewed the logs left by previous operators. They were clean, sparse, professional. No mention of noise, no anomalies. Still, I noticed a pattern I hadn't before. Every entry emphasized strict adherence to shutdown schedules, repeated almost defensively, as if someone had once considered not following them and decided against it. Near dawn, I performed the fourth shutdown. My hands shook as I reached for the control panel. The footsteps came faster this time, tightening their circle, overlapping slightly, as if more than one set had joined the patrol. I pressed my ear to the wall and felt vibration through the concrete, the sensation too regular to be incidental. I imagined figures moving in formation, unseen but coordinated, waiting for something. When the generator restarted, silence fell again. By mid-morning, exhaustion had blurred my judgment. I reasoned that if the footsteps only occurred during shutdowns, then the generator itself was the trigger. Perhaps sound carried differently without its constant hum. Perhaps my mind filled in gaps left by silence. To test this, I made a decision that still feels difficult to justify. I shut the generator down outside of schedule. The footsteps began before the engine fully stopped. They surged from all sides at once, a ring of motion tightening around the building. I heard them pass beneath the windows, felt them cross paths, perfectly synchronized. One set stopped directly outside the door. Another paused at the rear wall. They were no longer circling. They were standing watch. I turned the generator back on as quickly as I could. The sound ceased, but the sense of being observed did not. For the rest of the day, I kept the generator running continuously, ignoring protocols, waiting for relief that did not arrive on time. As evening approached again, the radio crackled with a delayed message informing me that weather conditions had postponed extraction until morning. I acknowledged calmly. I did not mention the footsteps. I am writing this now as the sun sets for the second time. The generator hums steadily beneath my feet. I have sealed the doors and blocked the windows. I am following the schedule again, because something out there seems to care deeply about it. In a few minutes, I am required to shut the generator down once more. I waited until the exact second the schedule required. The digital clock on the wall glowed a sterile blue, counting down the last moments before the mandatory shutdown. The generator's vibration traveled up through the floor and into my legs, a steady reassurance that bordered on dependence. I stood with my hand resting on the control panel, aware that I had begun to associate that sound with safety in a way that felt unhealthy and immediate. When the time came, I shut it down. The hum died slowly, like a breath being exhaled through clenched teeth. For half a second, there was nothing. Then the footsteps began. They did not rush in this time. They resumed their pattern as if they had never stopped, as if they had simply been waiting for permission. The sound wrapped around the building with flawless spacing, each step landing exactly where the last cycle had ended earlier in the day. There was no searching quality to them, no uncertainty. This was not something trying to locate me. This was something confirming its position. I stayed inside, lights off, watching the monitors even though I knew they would show nothing. The footsteps grew louder near the northern wall, close enough that I could hear the faint scrape of something brushing against concrete. It sounded like fabric or gear straps, shifting with motion. At one point, the rhythm faltered for less than a second, then corrected itself immediately, as if an error had been detected and resolved. My breathing felt too loud. I slowed it consciously, counting each inhale, afraid that any deviation might draw attention. I had the irrational thought that whatever was outside could hear patterns the way it produced them, that irregularity might be noticed. When the generator restarted automatically, the silence returned with such abruptness that it left a pressure behind, like the air itself had recoiled. I waited several minutes before moving. My hands were numb when I reached for the logbook. I wrote the time. I wrote, routine completed. I did not write anything else. The rest of the night passed in fragments. I drank water I did not remember opening. I checked locks I had already checked. Every sound inside the building felt amplified, intrusive. Pipes ticking as temperatures shifted made me flinch. Once, I thought I heard a footstep inside the hall, but it resolved into nothing when I stood up to investigate. Just before dawn, the generator's fuel monitor dipped lower than expected. It should have lasted longer. I told myself this was a calibration issue, but protocol required a manual inspection. That meant stepping outside while it was still running. I hesitated longer than necessary, then forced myself into my jacket and opened the door. The clearing looked unchanged. Morning light filtered weakly through the trees, flattening shadows but not fully dissolving them. The gravel around the building was disturbed. There were footprints. They circled the structure in a perfect ring, evenly spaced, pressed deep into the ground as if made by a heavy, uniform presence. The prints were boot-shaped, but indistinct, like the impression had been made through a layer of padding. I followed them with my eyes until they completed the loop, and returned to the door where I stood. None led away. None approached from the forest. They existed only around the building, as if placed deliberately. I crouched, examining one more closely. The depth was consistent, the spacing exact. This was not wandering. This was rehearsal. I completed the fuel check as quickly as possible and retreated inside. I locked the door harder than necessary and leaned against it, heart pounding. I told myself there had to be an explanation that did not involve intent. Training exercises, old equipment, Some kind of automated patrol system left behind and undocumented. The explanations felt thin even as I formed them. The radio crackled again mid-morning. Static cleared, and a voice came through, calm and professional, confirming my continued isolation and reiterating that extraction would occur at first light the following day. I asked if there had ever been security patrols assigned to the outpost. There was a pause before the response. The operator said no. I asked if anyone else was scheduled in the area. Another pause. Another no. I did not press further. As the day wore on, I noticed something else. The footsteps were not entirely absent when the generator was running. Occasionally, I would feel a vibration beneath the hum, a faint echo of movement that aligned itself with the building's perimeter. It was as if whatever waited outside was adjusting its pace to match the machine, syncing itself to the structure's internal rhythm. By late afternoon, I realized I was dreading the shutdown. Then the idea of the generator failing unexpectedly. At least when I controlled the moment, the pattern remained predictable. That thought disturbed me more than the footsteps ever had. The second sunset came faster than I expected. The sky dimmed into that heavy, bruised color that precedes full darkness. I prepared for the next scheduled shutdown with a strange sense of resignation. I checked the doors. I checked the lights. I checked the clock twice. When I cut the power, the footsteps resumed immediately, but something had changed. They were closer to the walls than before, tight enough that the sound no longer traveled evenly. I could hear overlapping passes, the cadence compressing, as if the patrol path had narrowed. At one point, I heard a distinct stop directly outside the door, followed by a soft shift of weight. The rhythm continued elsewhere, unbroken. I realized then that the pattern wasn't random repetition. It was escalation. When the generator came back online, the silence felt strained, incomplete. I sat down on the floor, back against the wall, and tried to make sense of what I was experiencing without allowing fear to dominate my thinking. But fear had already settled in, not as panic, but as a steady presence mirroring the footsteps themselves. I am writing this hours later. The generator is running. Night has fully settled. The footprints outside are no longer visible, but I know where they are. I know where they will be again. The next shutdown is approaching. I stopped pretending sleep was an option. The generator's steady vibration had become the only thing anchoring me to the present. A mechanical heartbeat that reminded me I was still in control of at least one variable. I sat at the desk with the lights dimmed, eyes fixed on the clock as it crept toward the next scheduled shutdown. Every instinct told me to ignore protocol, to keep the power running until morning, but something about the way the footsteps had adapted made me hesitate. They reacted to certainty. They followed structure. I had the growing sense that deviation might invite something worse than repetition. When the time arrived, I shut the generator down. The darkness felt heavier than before, as if the absence of sound had mass. The footsteps began instantly, but they no longer circled at a distance. They pressed close to the walls, so near that I could hear subtle differences between them. One step landed with a faint metallic click. Another carried the soft creak of leather under strain. They were not identical anymore. They were distinct, coordinated, and aware of their spacing. I held my breath and listened. The patrol completed one loop, then another. Then it stopped. For several seconds there was nothing. No movement. No sound. I counted silently, waiting for the generator's automatic restart. It did not engage. The control panel light flickered once and went dark. I realized then that the generator hadn't failed. It was waiting. The system required manual confirmation after an unscheduled fluctuation. My earlier override had changed its behavior. I was no longer protected by automation. Outside, a single footstep sounded directly in front of the door. It was closer than any before. Close enough that I could hear the shift of weight settling, the subtle adjustment of balance. Another step followed behind it, then another to the side. They were no longer moving in a loop. They were forming positions. I backed away from the door slowly, careful not to make noise. The radio sat on the desk, silent. I reached for it, thumb hovering over the transmit button, then stopped. I did not know who I would be calling, or what would say that could explain this without sounding unstable. The rules for communication were clear. Report confirmed threats. Do not speculate. Do not escalate without cause. The footsteps resumed, but not in motion. They shifted in place, small adjustments that suggested waiting. I felt a pressure build in my chest. The certainty that whatever was outside understood time better than I did. It knew the schedule. It knew what I was supposed to do next. I crossed the room and crouched near the control panel. The generator would start if I re-engaged it manually. I hesitated, listening to the silence between the steps, and made a decision I still don't fully understand. I left it off. The response was immediate. The footsteps began moving again, but the rhythm was wrong now. Faster, tighter. The spacing collapsed. Steps overlapping as the circle compressed inward. I heard them scrape along the walls, felt vibration through the floor, through my bones. Something struck the exterior once, not hard but deliberate. A test. Another impact followed, closer to the door, not forceful, patient. I scrambled to the panel and brought the generator back online. The engine roared to life, louder than I remembered. The footsteps stopped mid-motion. The sudden silence was so complete it rang in my ears. I slid down against the wall, heart pounding, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I stayed there until my legs cramped and my mouth went dry. When I finally stood, the sky outside the window had begun to lighten. Dawn was coming again. The generator fuel was low, dangerously low. I had burned through reserves, keeping it running continuously. I checked the gauges twice, hoping I was mistaken. I wasn't. If I did nothing, the generator would shut itself down within the hour. I understood then what the patrol had been doing. It wasn't reacting to the generator. It was enforcing it. The shutdowns weren't triggers. They were requirements. The patrol only manifested when the system entered a state it recognized as correct. When I interrupted that process, it adapted, waited, pressed closer. I pulled on my jacket and prepared to refuel. My hands shook as I unlocked the door. The clearing lay quiet, empty, washed in pale morning light. The footprints were there again, deeper than before, closer to the building, forming a tight ring that left no space between the wall and their path. I stepped carefully between them, feeling like I was violating something sacred. As I worked, I became aware of a presence behind me. Not movement, just proximity. I did not turn around. I finished refueling and went back inside, locking the door. The generator stabilized. The patrol did not resume. The radio crackled to life moments later. Extraction was inbound. I acknowledged with a steady voice and did not elaborate. When the relief team arrived, they found me seated at the desk. Logs complete. equipment operational. I told them nothing beyond routine maintenance issues. They asked why the fuel reserves were nearly empty. I said usage had been higher than expected. I left the outpost that morning. The building receded into the trees, indistinguishable from the forest that surrounded it. I thought it was over. Last night at home, my power went out briefly during a storm. In the silence that followed, I heard footsteps outside my house. They moved in perfect patrol rhythm. My name is Daniel Knox. I am a federal park ranger, badge number R4179, and I have been trained to document incidents clearly, chronologically, and without exaggeration. What follows is a complete and accurate account of what happened during a single overnight shift at a remote ranger substation in a protected wilderness area. I am writing this because official reports require omissions, and because I am no longer certain I will be able to explain this in person. I arrived at the substation shortly after 4:40 p.m., just before sunset. The location was a small, single-story concrete structure built into the slope of a wooded ridge, designed to serve as an overnight monitoring post during low-traffic months. I had worked similar posts before. The building had no windows on the north side, limited radio range, and thick interior walls meant to retain heat during winter patrols. The assignment was routine: remain on site until morning, monitor wildlife sensors, and log any radio traffic from trail cameras or backcountry beacons. No active search operations were ongoing. No weather warnings had been issued. Everything about the assignment was ordinary. I performed my standard arrival checks. Generator fuel at 70%. Emergency lights functional. Radio primary channel clear, secondary channel producing static but usable. The building smelled faintly of dust and disinfectant, the way all long, unused ranger facilities do. I logged my arrival time, signed my name in the ledger, and secured the steel door behind me. The lock engaged with a solid, familiar sound. I remember feeling calm. At 6:15 p.m., after eating a pre-packed meal and completing the first sensor sweep, I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It wasn't loud. It was barely audible, like someone speaking from the far end of a long hallway. The words were indistinct, filtered through layers of concrete and insulation. At first I assumed it was wind pushing air through the ventilation shaft. This building had a history of odd acoustics. Still, I paused my typing and listened. The sound stopped. I dismissed it and continued working. At 7:02 p.m. the sound returned, clearer this time, a whisper, close enough that I could tell it was inside the walls rather than outside the building. The voice was calm, neutral, almost careful. 4178. I froze with my hands over the keyboard. Those numbers were familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. They were not random. They were the first 4 digits of my Ranger ID number. I told myself it was coincidence. People hear patterns under stress. That explanation has gotten me through a lot of nights in the field. I stood up, walked to the central room, and checked the walls for vibration or loose fixtures. Nothing. The building was still. The forest outside was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after dusk, when daytime birds have settled and nocturnal animals haven't started moving yet. I returned to my desk. At 7:19 p.m., the whisper came again. "Second, just that. One number, spoken slowly," I said out loud. Radio check. Even though I wasn't transmitting, hearing my own voice helped steady me. I switched the radio to the secondary channel and listened. Static. No voices. No interference that would suggest someone broadcasting nearby. At 7:41 p.m., the whisper resumed. 417. It stopped there. I stood again, this time with my flashlight in hand, and checked the exterior walls, pressing my ear to the concrete, in several places like an idiot in a bad movie. The sound did not repeat while I was standing. It only happened when I was seated, relaxed, not actively listening for it. At 8:03 p.m., I wrote a note in the logbook. Auditory anomaly, possible environmental cause. Monitoring. I regret writing that now. It made the rest of the night feel like a test I had already failed. At 8:26 p.m., the whisper returned, closer than before. Clearer. It spoke my full Ranger ID number. 4179. But it didn't stop there. 8, 7, 6. I realized what it was doing halfway through the sequence. It wasn't counting up. It was counting down. My ID number ends in 9. The voice started at 9 and continued backward, one digit at a time, with long, deliberate pauses between each number, as if waiting for something to happen. I stood so fast my chair tipped over. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. I called into the radio, identified myself, and requested a check-in. No response. I tried again on the emergency channel. Still nothing. The radio showed signal strength, but the speaker remained silent. At 9:00 p.m., the building lights flickered. Just once. The generator didn't fail, but the momentary darkness felt intentional in a way I can't fully explain. I checked the generator anyway. Everything was normal. When I returned inside, the whisper resumed immediately. 5. That was not the next number. That was wrong. The correct sequence would have been 6. I said, "Who's there?" My voice cracked despite my effort to keep it steady. There was no answer. But I could feel the sound now, not just hear it. The vibration traveled through the floor and into my boots, like someone speaking directly into the structure itself. 4, the voice said. I backed away until my shoulders hit the far wall. I remember thinking, very clearly, that if the voice reached 0, something would happen. That thought didn't feel like fear or imagination. It felt like knowledge. At 9:14 p.m., I tried to leave. I unlocked the door, pulled it open, and stepped into the cold air. The forest looked wrong. Not distorted or unreal, just subtly off. The darkness between the trees seemed deeper than it should have been, as if the shadows were absorbing light instead of simply blocking it. My radio crackled once, sharp and loud, then went dead. Behind me, from inside the walls of the building, the whisper spoke again. 3. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking so badly it took 2 tries. I backed away, breathing hard, trying to think. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. A prank, a malfunction, stress, sleep deprivation, anything. 2, the voice said. It was right behind me now, or at least it sounded that way, though there was nothing there. The air felt heavy, pressing against my ears. I don't know why I did it, but I shouted my name, my full name, like declaring it might protect me. My name is Daniel Knox. The whisper paused. Then it said, very softly, 1. And that is where I am going to stop for now, because what happened next did not involve sound at all, and I need to be precise about how I explain it. After the whisper reached 1, the sound stopped so abruptly that the silence felt louder than anything that had come before it. My ears rang the way they do, after standing too close to a siren, and for a moment I wondered if I had lost my hearing entirely. I stood frozen in the center of the room, every muscle locked, waiting for something else to happen. Nothing did. The generator hummed steadily beneath the floor. The emergency lights cast their dull, yellow glow across the concrete walls. The building felt exactly the same as it had when I arrived, which somehow made it worse. I waited a full 60 seconds before I moved. I counted them in my head, afraid that if I lost track, the voice would return and correct me. When nothing happened, I forced myself to breathe normally and began checking my surroundings again, slower this time, more deliberately. I needed evidence of something tangible. A loose pipe, a radio malfunction, anything that could explain what I had heard. I checked the radio first. It powered on without issue, but every channel was silent, not even static. I toggled the antenna, adjusted the volume, and tapped the casing with my knuckle. Nothing. It was as if the device had been disconnected from the world entirely. I logged the malfunction in the notebook, my handwriting unsteady but legible. At 9:28 p.m., I noticed something new. The walls were warm. Not uniformly, but in narrow vertical bands, like heat rising along hidden seams. I pressed my palm against the concrete and held it there. The warmth wasn't enough to burn, but it was unmistakable. This building was designed to retain heat, but the generator had not increased output, and the outside temperature was dropping fast. There was no reason for localized hot spots to form like that. As I moved along the wall, following the warmth, I realized it formed a pattern. 4 bands, then a gap, then 1 band, then another gap, then 7, then 9, my ID number, laid out across the walls in heat. I pulled my hand back as if the concrete had shocked me. My heart was racing again. But this time there was no sharp spike of fear, no sudden panic. Instead, there was a heavy, sinking certainty settling into my chest. The voice hadn't been identifying me. It had been locating me. At 9:41 p.m., the whisper returned. It did not start counting again. It said my name, Daniel. The sound came from everywhere at once. From the walls, the floor, the ceiling, even the air inside my lungs. It was not loud, but it was intimate in a way that made my skin crawl. I backed toward the desk, gripping the edge so hard my fingers ached. "I'm a federal ranger," I said, "because training fills silence when your mind can't. If this is a prank, it ends now." The voice did not respond. Instead, I heard movement. Not footsteps, not scratching, but something shifting inside the walls, like heavy fabric being dragged slowly through a narrow space. The sound traveled clockwise around the room, steady and patient, completing a full circuit before stopping directly behind the wall at my back. I did not turn around. I stood there, staring at the desk map, my eyes fixed on the red circle, marking the substation's location, and tried to remember every safety protocol I had ever been taught. None of them covered this. None of them explained what to do when a building knows who you are. At 10:02 p.m., the lights dimmed again, this time staying low. The emergency bulbs flickered, then stabilized at half brightness. In the reduced light, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were markings on the floor near the walls, faint and uneven, like impressions left by something pressing repeatedly into the concrete before it had fully cured. They formed shallow depressions, long and narrow, arranged vertically, as if someone had been standing there for a very long time. The whisper came again, softer now. Remaining. That was the word it used. I swallowed hard. Remaining what? I asked, immediately regretting it. Engaging felt dangerous, but silence felt worse. "Remaining," the voice repeated, and this time I understood what it meant. The countdown hadn't been for me. It had been for everyone else. I thought of the previous ranger assigned to this post, the one whose transfer paperwork I had skimmed without much attention. I thought of the outdated log entries, the gaps in the records, the way this station always seemed to be staffed by someone new. I thought of the way the assignment briefing had emphasized that I would be alone. At 10:17 p.m., the door handle rattled. I spun toward it, my flashlight raised, beam cutting through the dim room. The handle moved slowly, deliberately, testing the lock. There was no sound from outside, no footsteps, no breathing. Just the metal turning a few millimeters back and forth, as if whoever was on the other side was learning how it worked. "I can't let you in," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know who I was talking to, or why I thought it would listen. The handle stopped moving. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the whisper came from directly behind the door, close enough that I could feel it through the metal. "You already did." The lights went out completely. In the darkness, I felt pressure against my chest. Not physical, not something I could push away, but the sensation of being compressed, reduced. The walls creaked softly, the sound of concrete under strain, and I realized the space was changing. The room wasn't getting smaller. I was becoming less significant within it. I don't know how long I stood there. Time felt unreliable, stretched thin and folded over itself. When the lights finally came back on, it was 11:03 p.m. Everything looked normal again. The walls were cool. The floor markings were gone. The door was still locked. The radio crackled to life with a burst of static, then settled into a low hiss. I laughed then, a short, broken sound that surprised me as much as it would have surprised anyone else. Relief hit me all at once, overwhelming and irrational. I told myself it was over. A stress response, a psychological episode brought on by isolation and fatigue. I wrote another note in the logbook, longer this time, more detailed, trying to capture what had happened before it slipped away from me. When I finished, I looked down at the page and felt my stomach drop. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was neat, evenly spaced, written with calm precision. At the bottom of the entry, where I should have signed my name, was my Ranger ID number. But one digit was missing. I stared at the logbook for a long time, long enough that the numbers on the page began to blur together. My Ranger ID, missing its final digit, sat there like an unfinished sentence. I flipped back through earlier entries, my pulse quickening with each page. The handwriting was consistent throughout the book, even across months, even across names I didn't recognize. Different signatures, different reported patrols, but the same careful spacing, the same pressure on the pen, as if one hand had written everything and simply learned to imitate the rest. At 11:17 p.m., the whisper returned. It did not come from the walls this time. It came from inside my head. "Remaining," it said again, not spoken so much as placed, gently and precisely, into my thoughts. I dropped the logbook and clutched my temples, pressing my palms hard against my ears as if that might block it. It didn't help. The voice wasn't sound. It was instruction. I tried the radio again, speaking faster now, my words tumbling over each other. I identified myself, gave my location, requested immediate extraction, medical if necessary. I repeated my Ranger ID number out loud, all of it, including the digit that was missing from the page. As soon as I said it, The radio emitted a sharp burst of feedback. Then a voice came through. It was my own, same cadence, same slight rasp on the consonants, same controlled tone I used in official transmissions. "Copy that," it said. "Remain at station. You are not alone." I pulled the radio away from my mouth and stared at it, my hands numb. The channel indicator flickered, then went dark again. I did not try to call back. I already knew there would be no answer. At 11:33 p.m., the building shifted. Not violently. Not enough to knock anything over, but enough that I felt the change through the soles of my boots. A subtle reorientation, like the sensation you get when an elevator stops and your body has to adjust. The air felt heavier again, and the lights dimmed just enough to make the shadows stretch. The whisper spoke once more, closer than ever. 0. Nothing exploded. No door burst open. No creature emerged from the walls. Instead, something far worse happened. The building recognized me. I don't have a better way to explain it. The space acknowledged my presence, not as an occupant, but as a component. The warmth returned to the walls, spreading outward from where I stood, flowing along the concrete like veins filling with blood. I could feel it matching my body temperature, sensing to my breathing my heartbeat. Every exhale felt borrowed. I staggered backward, knocking into the desk, and in that moment of panic, my elbow hit the emergency alarm switch. The siren wailed to life, piercing and shrill, echoing painfully off the walls. For the first time since arriving, I felt a surge of genuine hope. That alarm was hardwired. It didn't rely on radio signal or network coverage. It was designed to broadcast distress to any ranger unit within range. The whisper screamed. The sound tore through my head like tearing fabric, and I collapsed to my knees, hands over my ears, teeth clenched so hard my jaw ached. The siren cut off mid-wail, the switch snapping back into place on its own. The silence that followed was absolute. When I looked up, the room had changed. Not structurally. The same desk, the same map, the same equipment. But there were additions. Along the walls, where the warmth had been strongest, there were now impressions, clearer than before. Human-shaped recesses, standing upright, their outlines shallow but unmistakable. Some were tall, some were shorter. All of them faced inward, toward the center of the room. Toward me. I realized then what remaining meant. This station was not a place people passed through. It was a place they stayed. At 12:01 a.m., the front door unlocked. I did not touch it. The bolt slid back smoothly, as if operated by a perfectly maintained mechanism. The door creaked open a few inches, letting in a sliver of night air and the smell of pine and damp soil. Beyond it, the forest looked normal again. Dark, quiet, indifferent. The whisper softened. "You may leave." I crawled to my feet, every instinct screaming that this was a lie. A final test, but the part of me that wanted to survive was louder. I grabbed my pack, slung it over my shoulder, and approached the door slowly, half expecting it to slam shut. It didn't. I stepped outside. The moment my boots hit the dirt, the building exhaled. I felt it behind me, a deep, settling sound like a structure relieved of strain. The door closed on its own, locking with that same solid, familiar sound I remembered from my arrival. I did not turn around again. I walked into the forest, following the trail markers by flashlight. My radio dead, my thoughts fragmented. I walked for hours, until my legs shook and my throat was raw from breathing cold air. Just before dawn, I reached a service road and flagged down a maintenance truck. They took me to headquarters. They asked questions. I gave answers that sounded reasonable. Exhaustion, hallucinations, equipment malfunction. They nodded and wrote things down. When they checked my credentials, there was a pause. "Your ID number," the clerk said, frowning at the screen. "It's 1 digit shorter than standard." I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. I recited the number from memory. The clerk shook his head. "That last digit doesn't exist," he said. It never did. They reassigned me to desk duty pending evaluation. The station I worked that night was removed from rotation 2 weeks later, listed as structurally unsound. Officially, no one is stationed there anymore. But sometimes when I'm alone in the records room, late at night, I hear a whisper through the vents. Not counting, not naming, just waiting.